If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
Halloween is just a week away. Let's share some of the most terrifying, creepiest, and spookiest campfire stories, whether true or not, to tell around the fire.
I got home late one night, and my roommate's bedroom was closed. I assumed she was sleeping, but I noticed something out of the corner of my eye in the kitchen. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I didn't think much of it and went into my room, but before I turned on the light, something said, "I'm still here." I turned on my room light, but nothing was there, so I turned on every light in my house and knocked on my roommate's door, eventually opening it, but she wasn't there, so I left her light on as well and slept with all the lights on. When she returned the next morning, I asked if she was playing with me, and she started crying and said she had to leave because something in the house was bothering her and she needed to get out. My dad told us this one way back in the mid-80s. We were on a road trip traveling through an area where there wasn't much population for many miles, and we had stopped to eat a picnic my mom brought along. It was well past dusk but not completely dark yet. The story went like this: a family was on a road trip to Arizona or New Mexico. The thing about it was that they were on a similar highway with no towns nearby, just an empty road. As they were traveling, the car ran out of gas, so the dad told the family that he was going to see if there was a town down the road a bit, and as it was nighttime, they would be fine just waiting in the car, and the dad said whatever you do, don't open the car doors for anyone, and that he would be right back with gas. Some time went by, it was already dark and no cars had driven by for a long time, so Mom began to get worried. The kids were worried too, as it was dark and they were sitting in a dark vehicle. Suddenly the mom sees a man walking towards their car. He is carrying a bag and slowly approaches the car. As he is approaching the car, the mother is checking the car doors to make sure they are locked. The man begins to knock on the passenger side window, motioning for the mother to roll down the window. She shakes her head. No. He starts pounding on the windows. The kids start to freak out and cry. She yells out that she has a gun. The man walks over to the front of the car and places the bag on the hood. He turns and smiles as he walks off. Hours now pass and still no word from the father, and the morning is starting to break, so she is able to see down the road and no more mysterious man, so she nervously gets out of the car and goes to see what is inside the bag. When she opens the bag, it's her husband. One year when I was at summer camp, I went to go pick out my cabin, and all of the good ones were taken, so I took the one with windows facing the forest. The first day I had a blast. As I prepared for bed, I put on my pajamas, and my cabin mates did the same. I get homesick a lot, so I went to bed late. At around 3 a.m., all my cabin mates were asleep, so I sat there in silence. However, at around 2:30, I began to hear scratches at my window. I just thought it was a tree branch, but then I start hearing knocks at the window. They started off quite slow, then they would start to get faster and faster and louder till all of a sudden it went away. In the morning I tell everyone, and only one person believed me, so I thought they were just doing a sick prank, but I didn't believe that for long. For 3 nights in a row, I hear the same thing, but on the last night, night 4, the scratching and knocking start again. These ones go on for 5 minutes just hunting me. Then they stop, so I think they are gone, but then I hear the lock on our cabin door moving, and then the door opens. I get under my blanket and put my pillow over me and try to make it look like I'm not there. I hear footsteps walking around our cabin. I hear them getting closer to me, and then all of a sudden he stops and is digging through something and does that at every bunk but mine. Then he leaves and locks the door. I wake up in the morning to see that my cabin mates were gone, and it was early, around 6 a.m., breakfast wasn't out yet, and I look around, and my cabin mates are gone, but their shoes are there, and I knew that it was definitely that man. The police did a big investigation and never found the kids. John, Eric, Jason, and I decided to go on a camping trip with no particular destination in mind. We drove around until John decided that we should stop. The area was a forest in the mountains, just off the side of the road. As the sun began to set, we wandered from the road, deeper into the woods, trying to make base due to Eric's pickiness, until he finally found his ideal spot. We set up our sleeping bags, pulled out some beers, and finally started a fire. Darkness fell, and we were huddled around the campfire, laughing and telling stories. The fire began to fade, and Jason joked about playing Russian roulette to see who'd get the firewood since he always prepared with a sidearm on camping trips. I volunteered to go and scavenged around the woods to find enough firewood to last through the night for about an hour or so. I returned to the campfire, hearing the cheers of joy as I had brought life back to the spot. The night wandered on for about a couple more hours when we suddenly heard sounds of footsteps and chains in one direction. We saw behind some branches a dark figure, drenched in blood, dragging shackles, holding a revolver. Jason instinctively pulled out his gun and shot at the figure. The figure collapsed. Running up to the blood-soaked, stricken figure, I immediately noticed that his face was completely ripped off. It pointed behind me and weakly spoke with the voice of Jason, saying, "They're imposters." I turned around to see a vacant and empty campsite as the campfire blew out. On the way to a camping weekend in the White Mountains, a family witnessed a tragic accident on the Kankomagas. When police arrive, they reroute the family's car. This is the first time the family will stay at this particular campsite, so they find they must drive over the mountain to finally get to their campsite from the opposite direction of the same highway they were first on. When they finally get to settle in, it is dark, and they check the local news online. They learn that there was one fatality in the accident that they witnessed earlier in the day. They are now sitting by the fire and finishing up their dinner when a woman comes by. They were in the middle of nowhere, but they thought nothing of it since their campsite was one of several, and when they arrived, they did not have time to see how busy the campground was. The black-haired, young woman asked the family directions. She seemed confused. She has no jacket. And her hair is untidy. The family is not familiar with the area, so they direct the women to the main cabin of the campground. But they realize the office is probably closed. The woman wanders off before they could offer her further assistance. The next morning, they have all but forgotten about the car accident, the police rerouting them, and the lost woman. They all pile into the car and are ready to make a day of it. They plan to drive to the nearest trail to hike for a few hours. When they hit the main road, however, it quickly becomes clear to the parents that the accident they witnessed happened right outside the gates of their campgrounds. In fact, on the main road, the skid marks were clear as day, and some burnt pieces of wreckage still lay by the side of the road, all this, less than 100 yards from their fire pit. They stayed at the campsite all week. They never saw the woman again. However, when they finally went into town for supplies, they grabbed a local paper. The front page featured the story of the New York State woman who died on the highway earlier in the week. The story continued on the inside of the paper with pictures of the wreck and a photo of the young woman. She was young. She had black hair. And she looked exactly like the woman that walked up to the family on their first night at the site. We have a haunted stretch of road in our city, and my dad once told me about the time he and his friends were all hanging out. They began with plans to go, and they all met up in a diner parking lot in the city, and half of them decided to go down early to freak the other half out. When everybody showed up to the end of the street, they had their jump scare, and they were all joking and laughing and everything. As they were wrapping up the hangout, all of their cars died, despite being on less than half an hour ago and the radios being used 5 minutes ago, none of them are working. It's after a while of fiddling that my dad, having some automotive experience, was able to start it all up and get everybody going. His car was the last to start up. It was him at the end of this road with like 2 other people, and as soon as he gets his car started, somebody starts banging on the trunk so hard that the entire car starts shaking. So everybody visibly shaken, and him being the last one there, they book it. It isn't until he's back in the city that he realizes there's dents on his trunk where the banging was happening, like hard, heavy dents. That one always spooked me as a kid, true or not. My boyfriend and I recently purchased an old house. He's in charge of the new construction, converting the kitchen into the master bedroom, for instance, while I'm on wallpaper removal duty. The previous owner papered every wall and ceiling. Removing it is brutal, but oddly satisfying. The best feeling is getting a long peel, similar to your skin when you're peeling from a sunburn. I don't know about you, but I kind of make a game of peeling on the hunt for the longest piece before it rips. Under a corner section of paper in every room is a person's name and a date. Curiosity got the best of me one night when I googled one of the names and discovered the person was actually a missing person, the missing date matching the date under the wallpaper. The next day, I began listing all the names and dates. Sure enough, each name was for a missing person with dates to match. We notified the police, who naturally sent out the crime scene team. I overheard a technician say, "Yes, it's human." Human? What's human? Ma'am, where is the material you removed from the walls already? This isn't wallpaper you were removing. So, I'll start off by saying this isn't my story, it's my granddad's. He passed away a few years ago, but he was an extraordinary man, and I still believe he is watching over all of us. I lived in Germany for a few years as my dad's in the military. On the day we moved into our house, I looked out my window and saw a funeral taking place. It was at that moment we realized there was a large graveyard at the end of our garden. I had some spooky experiences at that house, which I will get round to talking about, but my granddad takes the cake with his stories. See, my granddad was a psychic. Whether you believe in them or not, my granddad saw/heard/knew things living people didn't. On one occasion, my mother was sitting downstairs, eating breakfast, and my granddad joined her. "Sleep well?" she asked, or something along those lines. My granddad responded, "No." This obviously worried my mother at the time because my granddad wasn't sleeping well. They wouldn't stop talking all night, all of them. I couldn't understand what they were saying. My mom was really concerned. She probably thought it was me and my brother messing around. She asked him who or what was keeping him awake during the night, probably expecting him to say me or my brother. But he pointed out of the patio doors at the graveyard that was a few meters from the house. It was then my mom realized it wasn't the living keeping him awake, but it was the ghosts in the graveyard, and the reason he couldn't understand what they were saying was because they were speaking German. When I was a kid, my father and I went up into the bush at the back of the farm to set some traps. Dad planned to set the trap line along the top of the ridge, then make camp some distance away, sleep overnight, and clear the traps in the morning. I thought of the trip as a great adventure. It had been quite a climb because the hill was over 1,000 feet high and the trail was 4 miles long. That's a long trek for a 12-year-old boy. Anyway, Dad set the traps, and we made camp in a clearing just as the sun was setting. I was really tired, so I went to bed in the tent straight after dinner. Dad sat on a fallen log by the fire for a while as I lay in the tent. Some time later, I woke briefly and looked out of the tent. Dad was still sitting on the log, looking into the flames. I had no idea what time it was. There was an old man sitting on the other end of the log. I just guessed that the old guy had seen the light of the fire and come into camp for some company. Dad and the old man were sitting there in silence, both looking at the fire. I went back to sleep. In the morning I asked Dad who the old man was, only to be asked, "What old man?" I described the man to Dad: tall, broad-shouldered, gray beard, one finger missing from the left hand. Black trousers, tramping boots, a blue jersey, and a wide-brimmed leather hat. Dad got very quiet and just looked at me for a moment. "I know who you're talking about now," he said finally. "That was old Tom Doherty. He went up in the forest hereabouts back in 1946 and never came out again." "Could he still be living up here?" I asked Dad. "He was in his 60s back in 46, Dad said. "If he were alive now, he'd be over 100 years old." "No, he's long gone. There's something evil in that lake." My dad bought the old lake house for quite cheap. The old owner's family was looking to get rid of it, and my dad was having his midlife crisis, which made the house an easy impulse buy for him. I had always loved swimming and playing games in the water, so my dad would take me up there during the summer. I would swim all the time and play with Pike, the neighbor's dog. One night I overheard the neighbors talking about the old owner as they were drinking and sitting around their campfire. He went swimming one morning and never came back. Eventually they found him dead and waterlogged, his skin peeling from his body. Fish had nibbled on his face. They were going to burn his body, but somehow they lost it. The body just vanished, and the rumor was it was still somewhere in the lake. It was hard to go swimming after hearing that. Eventually, I got over my fear. Then, one night, I was awakened suddenly at some odd hour. I remember having a dreadful feeling sitting at the depths of my stomach. I got up to go find my dad for comfort. When I exited my room, I heard strange sounds. I crept toward my dad's room. The door was slightly ajar. I peered through the crack in the door, and what I saw made my blood go cold. My father was on his bed, and a figure stood over him, its face buried in his gut. It was feeding on him. Unable to control my fear, I let out a peep. The creature looked immediately, and I saw its face. I saw its glazed eyes, unhinged jaw, and rows of sharp teeth. It had skin that was waterlogged and falling off, with small nibbles taken from it, and it was soaked with blood. I ran out the back door, and I hid behind a bush. The creature followed quickly. It stood in the yard, and I felt my heart pounding so loud I was afraid it would hear. It scanned the yard, trying to locate me. I was on the verge of tears when I heard a bark. It was Pike. He had gotten out again. Sensing the creature, Pike began barking, but it didn't last long. With animal ferocity, the creature leapt into the neighbor's yard. Pike whimpered. Then it was quiet. I watched the creature drag poor Pike into the lake. Then it was gone. One of the neighbors found me in the morning and called the police. Nobody believed my story when I told it. Instead, they began searching for a killer they'd never find. After that, I demanded that my mom move to a new state. Now we live in Arizona. It's fine living here. At times I hate the heat, but the nice thing about the desert is that there are no lakes. Our campfire stories. So, summer came, and with all the fun that comes with it, me and my friends decided to go camping. What fun part of camping, you might recall, is setting up the tents or having a marshmallow barbecue. My favorite is the scary stories around the campfire. Me and my 3 friends sit in a circle around the fire and take turns telling scary stories. George was up first. He had nothing special. Just some boring headless horseman story nobody cared about. Next up was Lily. She told a quite spooky story about some diaresis, mistress of the forest, diaresis or whatever it was called. Sarah had a quite interesting story, as a matter of fact. She told us of how she survived an encounter with a weirdo, no bravery or making herself look like a hero, just the real story and how she managed to evade it. Go on, John. Tell us your story. Me? Please, I already told you all I had. We've been dead for 40 years, you expect me to have something after all of them? But I lied. I did have a story. Our story. The abandoned house. Miller, Jenny, and Ray were spending Halloween night exploring the abandoned house at 5th and Alvers. Miller, the thrill seeker, decided to have some fun in the evening and had managed to, finally, drag Jenny and Ray along with him. They didn't know much about the place, except for the murders. Miller walked down the upstairs hallway of the house. He knew how the other 2 felt, but he didn't care, he was having a blast. As he walked, the spooky vibe thrilled him. It was dark, the wood was worn and rotting, and it all gave off a dark vibe. Then Miller heard something. Laughter, coming from down the hall. Curious, he moved towards it. Was someone else here? Confused, he looked into the room it was coming from. The room was brightly lit and pristine, pink wallpaper, stuffed animals, and a girl, about 8, in a pink dress sitting at a table with miniature teacups spread over. Miller looked on in disbelief. This was impossible, this couldn't exist, not in this condition. Noticing him, the girl looked up at him and smiled. Hi. Do you want to join my tea party? 2. Jenny stomped down the main floor hallway. This is stupid, she grumbled. What was the point of being here? It was a waste of time. As she kept passing the same doorways, she realized she was walking in circles. God ducking damn it, she muttered, finally deciding to call it quits. Working her way back to the foyer, she was stunned to witness the foyer now fully restored, perfectly painted, and not a scratch in sight. Further, it was filled with revelers, young people in costumes shouting happily as they drank from plastic cups. As Jenny, shocked, slowly descended the stairs, a guy in a toga costume shoved himself in her face, holding up a plastic cup. Hey, have a drink? He asked brightly. 3. Ray wasn't happy. He'd come to impress Miller, but he was cold and freaked out. Finally, after stopping and thinking, he decided he was done. Walking down the hallway, he started to look for his friends. Noticing a door ajar ahead, he peered in and screamed. Miller's body was on a child's chair. Backing away in horror, Ray took off for the main entrance. Rounding the corner, he began to tear down the staircase, only to gasp at what he saw above the foyer floor. He saw Jenny, suspended from the ceiling by her arms. His heart pounding hard, he took off down the stairs, out the door, then across the yard. Turning back, he was certain he'd escaped. The bodies were found by the police days later. Miller in the upstairs bedroom, Jenny in the foyer, and Ray in the bathroom. Very few dared approach the house from then on. At my job, I am lucky enough to hear fun stories about weird goings-on in the woods from old-timers. I'll share 2 of my favorites. 1. A sweet older lady told me this one. Her grandparents and great-grandparents used to earn extra money by traveling from farm to farm and helping with hay harvests and threshing. They would sleep over in their clients' barns along with the horses they brought along with them. Anyway, one night, the family is all snug in the barn, ready to fall asleep after a long day of work, when they hear someone walking around the hay loft and muttering to themselves. Thinking their host must be checking on something up there, they thought nothing of it and gradually fell asleep. Later that evening, they heard several people walking around the loft, talking to each other, though they couldn't quite make out what was being said. Thinking they might need help with something, the patriarch of the traveling thresher family climbed into the loft to offer assistance. Following a loud thud, Grandpa stumbled down the ladder and ordered his family to pack up and get the horses hitched. Once they were on the road, in the middle of the night, mind you, Grandpa finally told them what he'd seen in the loft. Apparently there were shadow people darting around the loft that didn't match any light patterns coming in from the moon outside. When Grandpa called out to them, thinking they were in fact people and his eyes were simply playing tricks on him, the shadows stood absolutely still, and out of nowhere came the loud thud that woke everybody else up. According to the little old lady who shared this story, her aunts and uncles all loved telling it, but Grandpa refused to ever talk about it again. 2. One of my favorite people I'm lucky enough to chat with at work has so many great stories. His house has been in his family for generations and was known as the place for French-Canadian immigrants to get together and party in the early part of the 20th century. According to him, the party's still going, only spirits are the guests. He's heard music and stomping, something that's corroborated by other people who have lived there. Also, this guy's a gem. His brother was in the woods during deer hunting season near what was once an old German farming settlement in the 1800s and heard a small child say "come play with me" several times before he got fully spooked and booked it back to camp. The Forest Man. The Forest Man was a campfire horror story my uncle used to tell us down at his cabin. My brother and I had tried summer camp but always tended to wander off to explore the darkened woods out of boredom. Uncle Ted was a bit of a hermit and knew the forest depths like the back of his hand. Fortunately for our parents, he had no trouble watching over us throughout the summer months. He'd tell the tale of the crazed, leaf-covered spirit who guarded the woods from curious little boys, protecting the secrets of the wild and preserving the natural balance. A normally benevolent spirit who went mad from decades of being forgotten and now roamed the deep searching for people to munch on. Uncle Ted said only human flesh could make the Forest Man feel sane again, so he became the perfect hunter. We knew it was a joke, even though our uncle tried to spook us by timing the snapping of twigs or roar of thunder. But he could never keep a straight face for more than a few seconds. He was a jovial fellow, maybe partially because of his happy juice, but a wonderful person to be around. Well, until that one night. It started out like any other night, with hot dogs and s'mores by the fire. Uncle Ted was telling us the story of the Forest Man again, but partway through he stopped and stared at the edge of the forest. Uncle T. Shh. My brother and I exchanged glances, then watched as Uncle Ted tried to get us inside. We had a feeling something was wrong, and as we entered the cabin, we heard a deafening screech. It was so loud we had to hold our ears, like an ambulance was right in front of us but the siren was crossed with nails on a chalkboard. We rushed inside, looking out the window to see Uncle Ted cocking a shotgun and walking slowly towards the woods. We saw some movement, then suddenly deer, foxes, and every sort of forest creature you could think of came pouring out. In the midst of them was a roundish creature covered in leaves with glowing eyes. It jumped instead of running, right into our uncle, and knocked him over. The shotgun rang out, and we dove, screaming. "It's him. It's the Forest Man." My brother whimpered. Just as I tried to put my hand over his mouth, he entered. We stayed quiet, trembling with fear. "Be please, Mr. F. Quiet, little ones. They'll hear your voice." Uncle Ted died that night, screaming bloody murder as the things from the forest tore into his flesh. We saw none of it, and I hope to never hear of them again, nor see the Forest Man, despite what he told us. They've returned. The ancient ones. Okay, here in Germany, we have many abandoned places with old histories. These sites are more ancient than you can possibly comprehend. In my hometown there was the border line between the then Roman Empire and the old Germans. On this line stands an old watchtower now only in ruins, just a few yards from my home where I'm grown up. This site was always a site where cruel things happened or someone was infected by the infested ground. Many old lives got lost on this wood wall to shut out the barbarian Germans off the Rome Empire. You can feel it when you go through the woods that are now standing around this old border. It's in the air when you come closer. The goosebumps come even though it's a hot night in the summer. Shadows running between the trees, odd screaming from the distance, and nobody could tell about it anymore. I was about 7 or 8 years old. My grandfather's house stood on an old mining purification building of the mine besides. This building burned down in 1880, and all of the miners were looked up at because of the shutterwood wall in front. Nobody came out. My room in the attic was covered in wood. I loved those faces that I've seen in the knotholes. One night I woke up from knockings. I first didn't know where it's coming from or who knocks. It gets louder before it stops before I could yell for my mother. This goes on and on every night in November. Sometimes I lay in bed and knock with my fingers on the wall. 1 time. And it knocks back. 2 times. And it knocks 2 times back. 3 times. The hard bangs came back that almost shocked the whole house. Years after that, I connected the dots. No one is allowed to cross the border or come out. Dead or alive. Now let me tell you a story that my grandfather used to tell. Although I never believed in them, I wish to share them since he passed recently. There once was a family of 3, a father, a mother, and a child. You see, they lived in a cabin miles away from the closest town, But one day the father came home from his job. He was fired from his job. He was tired of life, so then he finally snapped, so he pulled out his gun from the top of the fireplace. He went and found his wife and helped her go to sleep for a very long time as his child was playing outside in the backyard. So he went to finish the job, and when the father found his child, the father kneeled down and put his child asleep as well, and then he put the gun to his head, and then he went out with a bang. But yet the story isn't over, for the child was not found. And now if you go to those woods and you hear the chopping of wood and the dragging of chains, then you better cover your ears, close your eyes, and walk away from the sound as fast as you can, because if you don't, you may just meet the child that supposedly died, and trust me, you very much don't want to meet him, because you may just join the others who met him, and of course they never came out of those woods. When I was maybe 8 to 9, I lived in an older, 2-story house. My room was on the right of my sister's room, and my parents' room was across this game room to the left. My room was small and on the corner of the second story. Once you left my room, on the right was a wall and windows, so nowhere to go except straight or left. Anyways, I usually liked to change which side of the bed I slept on. One night it would be the side facing the door, another night it would be facing the closet. Well, the night before I decided to sleep facing the door. I woke up early in the morning, but the sun was up, so I could still see. I just kind of laid there for a while. Just thinking, I guess, until out of nowhere a tall skinny man, completely black skin with no clothes, not like the race but instead the color black, walks past my door in a somewhat fast way. I had waited about 5 seconds before standing up and peeping my head around the corner. Nothing. No, man, nothing. I checked to see if it was my dad, but he was asleep in my sister's room. Parents were going through a rough patch, and sister wasn't home. He reminds me of a stick figure in some ways when I think about it. The house was pretty spooky though. My parents said I used to have full-blown conversations with some girl in my room and play with her, and another crazy thing was that when people came to buy the house after we moved, they said they saw a little girl standing in the master bedroom closet. Freaky. Things that lurk in the dark. We all know that they are there. You, me, even somebody as mundane as your 50-year-old uncle who has never had a single interesting thing happen to them. No matter who they are, they know that things lurk in the darkness, things that don't make sense. Now I know what you were thinking. This guy is a nut job, nothing's in hiding in the dark. And trust me, I know how it feels. But go look into that one dark hallway in your house. Look at it closely. Do you get that funny feeling in your stomach? The feeling of unsettled paranoia, not knowing what lurks behind the thin veil of darkness. You may want to reach for a light switch, you may feel the intense need to run and hide under the covers, but one thing remains the same. That thing being the fear of the dark. Now I'm very aware of the reason for this fear, the whole evolution thing. Our ancestors had to worry about a tiger or some other type of beast grabbing them, never to be seen again sucking into the darkness, never to be seen alive by another person. However true that may ring, it's not the only reason for our innate fear of the dark. You see, the human mind is a powerful thing. It can create life so surreal and commit actions so heinous while only having to think. Now to us, these thoughts mean nothing more than a gust in the wind, gone without a second thought. But over generations, those thoughts became very real indeed. And with so much time, these things grow stronger. And I fear if we all keep feeding into our innate human fear, we may not be able to hold them back much longer. The thing outside the window. It all started with a faint noise that brought me from slumber. Tap, tap, tap. At first I thought it was a bird tapping against the window, or maybe even a bat. The noise continued behind the thick curtain. I didn't want to get out of bed to check. I was ducking terrified. All kinds of scary possibilities crept into my mind, like, what if it's a serial killer taunting me before breaking in to cut my throat? Or maybe it was a burglar? But why would a burglar want to alert me to their presence? A burglar didn't seem likely. It's definitely a serial killer. The tapping became louder, and so did the beat of my heart. I needed to know what it was, my nerves couldn't take it any longer. I slowly got out of bed and snuck over to the window. All the while I couldn't get that window scene from Stephen King's Salem's Lot out of my head. Vampires aren't real, you are just being silly. I hesitantly drew the curtain. A pale, round moon-like face was peering in at me with bulbous, jet-black eyes that bulged from their sockets. It smiled a horrible grin, like the smile of a great white shark that has caught the scent of blood. Those teeth looked like they could chew up Sheffield steel with ease and sink into flesh like a hot knife through butter. I rubbed at my eyes, thinking it was all just a nightmare. Yet the creature remained floating outside the window as its hideous grin widened even further. "Aren't you going to let me in?" The creature pressed its round white face up against the glass. It's awfully cold out here. Who are you? I asked, failing to hide the tremble in my voice. A friend, the creature replied, with a sinister tone that suggested otherwise. Go away. Leave me alone. I closed the curtain and proceeded to grab my baseball bat from under the bed. The creature continued to tap at the window, followed by a new sound, a wet, squeaky sound, like a damp sponge wiping glass. I gripped the baseball bat tightly and approached the window again, then drew the curtain. The glass was now covered in thick snail trails of saliva as the creature peered through. Are you going to let me in or what? No. Now go away. Too bad. We could have had a lot of fun. The creature licked the glass with its long forked tongue. I can almost taste you. The creature then floated off into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. And the next morning I saw police cars and an ambulance outside Jill's house down the road. I would later find out that Jill had been brutally killed and partially eaten by a wild animal that had somehow gotten in through her upstairs window. But I know the real story. She had let the moon-faced creature in. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where the air bites just enough to keep you awake. My friends and I had gathered around a campfire deep in the woods, far from any town or even a proper road. The flames flickered and danced, sending shadows darting into the trees, making the darkness feel alive. We had spent the day hiking and were looking forward to unwinding, sharing stories, and drinking until we were too drained to care about the cold. Little did I know, that night would leave me with a memory that still haunts me to this day. It was nearing midnight, the fire burning low, and the conversation had turned to ghost stories. Most were silly or predictable, the kind of tales that you tell with a smirk, knowing they wouldn't really scare anyone. But then, in the lull of the chatter, Jake spoke up. Jake was usually the quiet one in the group, never one to dominate the conversation. But that night, he had something to say. I don't really believe in ghosts, Jake began, his voice low, almost hesitant. But there's something out here in these woods. My grandfather told me about it when I was a kid. He was a logger and worked in these forests his whole life. He called it the thing beneath. A nervous chuckle went around the fire, but Jake's expression stayed deadly serious. Grandpa said it was something ancient, older than the trees, older than the earth itself. It's been here for centuries, maybe longer. People go missing in these woods more often than you'd think. Not many, but enough to make you wonder. But it's not just that they get lost or hurt. They disappear, gone without a trace. Grandpa said that those who vanish don't really leave. The forest just swallows them. Jake leaned closer to the fire, his face illuminated in an eerie, flickering light. He told me the thing beneath doesn't hunt like an animal. It doesn't need to. It waits. It's patient. You don't even know it's there until it's too late. You could be sitting by a campfire, just like this, and you'd feel this tug, like the ground itself is pulling you down. Just a little at first, barely noticeable. And then, before you know it, you're sinking, and the harder you struggle, the faster it drags you under. We all sat there, silent, the crackling of the fire suddenly too loud in the oppressive stillness. I could see the skepticism in everyone's eyes, but there was something in Jake's tone that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way his gaze never left the ground, like he was afraid to look up, afraid to see something lurking just beyond the firelight. People have tried to dig down to see where it goes, Jake continued, but the earth is always solid, undisturbed. No holes, no tunnels, nothing. It's like the forest heals itself, covering its tracks. And the ones who do manage to come back, they're never the same. They're empty. Whatever was inside them. It's gone. As if the thing beneath took more than just their bodies. A gust of wind sent a shiver through the trees, and I felt a sudden, irrational fear take root in my chest. I glanced around, half expecting to see the ground beneath us start to move, to shift and pull us down into the darkness. Jake finally looked up, meeting each of our eyes in turn. He told me something else, too. He said if you're ever out here and you feel that tug, that shift under your feet, you don't run. Running makes it worse. You have to stay still as possible, and pray it loses interest. Because if it doesn't, there's nothing you can do. You're gone. No one said anything for a long moment. The fire crackled, the trees whispered, and I swear I could feel the earth shifting beneath me, as if it were alive, as if it were hungry. Eventually, we laughed it off. Nervous, uneasy laughter, but laughter nonetheless. We called Jake a good storyteller and tossed back another drink, but the atmosphere had changed. The night was colder, the dark more oppressive. We ended up turning in early, each of us retreating to our tents, the safety of our sleeping bags. But I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees, made my heart race. I lay there, staring up at the roof of my tent, half expecting to feel that pull, that awful sinking sensation. And sometimes, even now, years later, when I'm alone in the woods or lying in bed late at night, I think about Jake's story. I wonder if it was just that, a story. Or if there really is something out there, something ancient and patient, waiting beneath the earth. And when I feel the slightest shift under my feet, I hold my breath, stay as still as I can, and pray it loses interest. Were the legends of the siren real? Me and my friends were going to a forest in the middle of the night for camping. We placed our tents but then heard siren noises in the distance but ignored it because we thought it was a prank. We decided to tell some stories around the campfire and went to sleep. One of us went to investigate the sirens, and then he screamed, and I thought it was a prank. Another one of us went to check if he was okay, but then he also screamed, and I thought to myself, they definitely planned this to prank me, but the sirens only got louder, so then I went to check. I was horrified to find that there were 2 dead bodies on the floor and blood everywhere, and I regret not believing their screams. Then the sirens were getting louder and closer, and it felt like something was behind. Then I checked and saw an extremely tall, skinny humanoid with a siren as its head and realized that this was one of the stories that they were talking about, and it was true. I quickly ran to seek help and found nothing. I panicked to see if it's still behind, but it has vanished, God knows where. Well, hello, y'all. Here's a fun little story that seems to be never ending in my life. I'll preface with saying I used to go to a summer camp for 7 years, up to 3 weeks throughout each summer there. I adore this place, and it's truly the reason I am the person I am today. Of course, we had our ghost stories that we told, most of them fake. But there is one real one, and man, I'm getting chills just writing it. There was a girl who died at the camp back in the 70s. Let me say it again, she really did die there. I saw the records as a last night gift. She died of a heart issue during a soccer game. She had been complaining of headaches all week, and then she suddenly collapsed and died in the basement of the main lodge. It's very tragic. But she always wore a yellow raincoat everywhere, that was her thing. And many a staff member has claimed to see her on the steps of her old cabin crying at night. I forgot about the story and told it simply as a campfire ghost story, in much better detail than this, I assure you. Anyways, years go by, and I head off to college. I made friends with some people who were highly in tune with the paranormal. I go to college in a completely different state, 7 hours away. But my one friend was able to distinctly describe to me how this little girl looks out of the blue. And how the camp looked overall. I had never told her this story prior to her description. My friend told me this girl had attached herself to me. My assumption is that I keep her memory alive. And I know her name, though I will never speak it. It's been over a year since that night, and ever since I can see her sometimes at night. She'll either be standing in my bathroom, just observing, or standing somewhere. And I never get an overly negative feeling, but it's not positive either. And I've gotten used to it. I moved into a new house this year, and I hadn't seen her in quite a while. But the other night, after some quiet, I woke up at 3:37 a.m. I looked over to a chair in my room, and I saw her. Sitting on the floor crying. I just looked, felt that sadness, and went back to bed. I didn't want to give that attention. And I've been thinking about this ever since. I just wanted to get this off my chest to other internet strangers who understand. My reflection won't stop smiling. I noticed it a month ago, in the bathroom mirror. I was tired, struggling to get ready for school, when I saw myself hunched over the sink, grinning from ear to ear. I chalked it up to exhaustion, my poor sleep schedule, until, in the middle of an impossible math test, I found myself looking over at the classroom window, and there he was, staring back, smiling wide. I got paranoid. Decided to test anything and everything that showed my reflection. Bus windows, street puddles, and phone screens. He was always there. Eyes alert. Teeth gritted. Smiling as if it hurt. I tried to ignore him. I didn't want my parents or my younger sister to worry about me. But soon my reflection grew bored. Shifted. Started moving on its own. Not even pretending to match me. At breakfast one morning, in the kitchen window, while Mom discussed her plans to pick up me and Sarah after school, I watched, helpless, as my reflection got up from the table, reached into a cupboard, and poured an entire bottle of pills into my mother's coffee mug. The next morning, an ambulance took her to the emergency room. The doctors had no answers. I don't leave my room anymore. Not after last week, when I checked on Sarah, crying in her room because of Mom's worsening condition. I tried to comfort her, not even thinking about what I was doing. My reflection didn't hesitate. In the small mirror on her bedside table, I watched him, smiling brightly, grab a pair of scissors from her dresser and hold them to her throat. Staring me down. As if to say, go on. Try me. My father is concerned. He doesn't understand my self-isolation. He's running out of excuses to tell the school. He begs me to come out of my room. To see a counselor. To get help. But I can't. Not since my reflection changed the game, one last time. Not since last night, when I tiptoed to the edge of my bedroom mirror, hoping to surprise him, terrified of what I'd find. I looked into the mirror. I braced myself for the worst. For that awful, proud, cruel smile. But my reflection was gone. A few years ago, I moved into a charming old house on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that oozed character, with its vintage architecture and overgrown garden. But there was something about it, something just a little off. At first, I chalked it up to the quirks of an old house. The creaky floors, the occasional flickering of lights, it all seemed like part of its charm. But then the phone calls started. It was always around midnight when the phone would ring. At first, I thought it was a prank or just the wrong number. I'd answer, and all I'd hear was heavy breathing on the other end. Unsettling, yes, but not enough to alarm me. I figured someone was just messing with me. But the calls didn't stop. In fact, they became more precise, more deliberate. Every night, right at midnight, the phone would ring, and the same breathy silence would greet me. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just someone with too much time on their hands. Then, one night, the caller finally spoke. Instead of the usual heavy breathing, a voice, cold and distant, whispered, "I'm here now." The line went dead before I could respond. That message sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, I decided to record the calls, hoping to catch something that could explain what was happening. When I played back the recording, I noticed something even more disturbing. In the background, barely audible, was a faint whisper, "Come find me." That was the breaking point. The sense that someone, or something, was watching me became unbearable. I scoured the house for any clues, any signs that might explain the strange occurrences, but there was nothing. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The unease grew night after night, until I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and moved out of that house, leaving it behind like a bad dream. It sat empty for a while after I left, its windows dark and lifeless. I haven't been back since, but I've heard stories from locals. They say the house is still there and that it's still haunted. People talk about late-night phone calls and strange whispers in the dark. Maybe it's just a local legend that's grown over time. But I know what I experienced was real. So, if you ever find yourself in that part of town and you hear a phone ringing in the dead of night, take my advice, don't answer. Some things are better left unexplored. This story happened over the winter. It all started as a normal night, and my friend C and I were hanging out just discussing our usual subjects, his weapon collection, video games, just normal things. We were sitting there, and another one of our friends calls us and says, "Hey, do you mind if I hang out with you guys?" We said sure because we were already bored out of our minds. We'll call him Don. Don replies, "I have my car. We can go shoot off our friends' weapons." We all agree because we've done it many times, and we go to the middle of the woods and no one bothers us. We leave and are on our way. We thought we knew the way to the location we go to because we've gone out there constant times, but that was our first mistake. We ended up getting lost. This is crucial to the story. Thank God my dad's car at the time was an off-roading Ford Escape. We went down this narrow path that was very winding and heavily wooded. At this moment, we realized we had crossed over from Pennsylvania to West Virginia. We finally believe we've made it to the path that we knew got us to where we normally go, but it wasn't, and all of a sudden, when C and I look at each other, we are both as pale as the winter moonlight that night. He says to me, "Do you feel like we are being watched?" Me, who openly admits to being a Satan worshipper and believes in demons and does some witchcraft, says, "I do believe something is watching us, but it's not natural." Don starts laughing and says, "Well, we are near the place they filmed Silent Hill." We all nervously chuckled. It wasn't until our car stopped. Don's lights hit the path, and it's covered in snow. A giant flooded stream is in our way. He goes and says, "One of us gotta get out." I look at him and say, "No chance I'm getting out," and C says, "Nope, I'm not leaving this car," as he said that he loaded a silver-cased round in his pistol and held it close. Don gets out. He says it's actually nice out here, peaceful and quiet. I get out as well, and that's when this fog rolls in. It was heavy, and it was very unusual. That's when I looked over and saw a giant fresh blood mark in the snow. I called Don over, He looks at it and is taken away by what he saw and dismisses it and says, "An animal probably got attacked here," but I interrupted him and said, "There's no prints, nothing." He turns to me and says, "Well, we gotta get across this creek, which isn't too deep to cross." At this point, we're all beginning to feel like prey. We crossed the creek and decided to turn around. Barely making it through this path that was made for quads, not a O4 escape. We finally got out, but whatever was waiting at the end of the trail was something I can't even explain. It was way too big to be a dog or wild, and it was making almost human-like screams. Its eyes were bright green. C and I discussed it could have possibly been a skin crawler because there were deer around it, and the deer didn't even notice it, but we did. My experience with the Lantern Man. I was eating with my friends at night on a camping trip in Minnesota, and we had gotten bored out of our minds. We decided to skim the radio station since our cell phones were out of range of anything interesting. We listened to some of the oldies and conked out at around 1 o'clock. Someone had left the radio on the setting that skips stations, so before long we woke up to the sound of loud static. I got out of my sleeping bag and tried stepping out of the tent to try to switch it off, but the zipper kept getting stuck. While I was messing with that, through the orange plastic, I started to see 2 bright lights at the edge of the clearing. We must have attracted something else with all the sound coming from the radio because it seemed too hunched over to be human. I was able to get the zipper unstuck and open the zipper so I could get a better view of the odd luminescence. It edged forward slowly, but in the pale light of the moon I could see the horrible figure. Its body was malformed, almost indistinguishable from the darkness but unmistakable. Its legs were bent like those of a bird, backwards, but it still seemed human somehow. The static from the radio seemed to grow louder in intensity. The bright lights were coming from its eyes, a terrifying, blinding white light. I was so afraid that without thinking, I leaned back and zipped up the tent, paralyzed by fear. I heard the rustling of leaves, and that was it. The next morning one of my friends was gone. He was found at the bottom of a cliff, a bloodied corpse with no eyes. The radio was dead. I had made an effort to remove the batteries afterwards. The authorities think he wandered off and fell, but I know what I saw. I copied down the number to the radio station, but there are no listings for anything like it in the area. I'm not giving it away either. I don't want anyone else to die because it somehow attracts the creature this Lantern Man, no matter where it is. Camp Headless. A teenage girl was hiking through some woods up in southeast Canada one morning in 1951. She found a summer camp, seeing a teenage boy painting a sign. "Hello, I am Debbie Sanders, I am the new camp counselor here," the girl introduced herself to him, explaining. The teenagers shook hands. "Hi Debbie, I am Pete Newton, another camp counselor here." Welcome to Camp Maple." The teenage boy introduced himself and welcomed Debbie. Pete continued painting the sign blue that read, "Welcome to Camp Maple," in red letters. Debbie went into a cabin and put her bag on a bed, going into the kitchen. That evening, Pete Newton and Debbie Sanders sat around a campfire outside. There is a legend here about a woman who worked here when the camp opened in 1922. She was chopping weeds by one of the cabins and swatted some flies with her knife. She mistakenly cut her throat with it, falling down and decapitating herself, Pete told. "Campers have seen her headless zombie wandering around the area each summer," he finished. "That is horrible, Pete," Debbie replied. "Just a story, Debbie," he answered, smoking a cigarette. "The kids have called this place Camp Headless for a few years," Pete said. Later on, as Debbie was cooking a pot of tomato soup on the stove, she heard a little knock on the cabin door. Debbie turned off the stove and looked out the cabin window. The door opened, and Debbie saw a headless zombie. It was dressed in a white dress, and its flesh was decayed and rotting. The decomposed neck oozed with a disgusting mix of slime, the colors of white and red. Debbie screamed in complete horror, opening the kitchen window and climbing out, running. She ran through the darkness to another cabin. Debbie turned, watching the headless corpse approach her, a moldering head of brown and decayed flesh dangling in its rotting hand. The zombified head, with mold-covered, long hair and black, hollow eye sockets, smiled, speaking to Debbie, "Good evening, young lady, can I make you some tea?" Debbie felt the corpse's moldy hands of rot touch her hair, twisting its decomposed fingers on her scalp. "Pretty hair," the zombified head croaked in a dry voice. Debbie screamed and looked back, discovering the zombie was gone. The only sounds were the crickets. A story my grandma told me when she was still alive and lucid. She lived in the southeast of France with my uncle, who loves engaging in long walks in the forest with his 2 kids and his wife. My grandma was worn out this day, so she decided to stay in the car and read. It was a sunny and nice day. My uncle was hesitant about leaving her alone, but he parked at the entrance of the forest, so he assured her that they wouldn't be long. My grandma was a tough woman. She lived a lot of challenging situations and overcame them one by one. She was a very logical person and never liked urban legends and things like that. Well, she was sitting in the car all by herself, reading and relaxing. She had a large view in front of her. I don't really know how to explain that since English is not my first language, but there was some kind of empty field in front of her, just before the forest. My uncle took a little more time than he thought he would. They went to the forest at 3 p.m., and it happened at 7 p.m. when the sun began to set. My grandma started to hear sounds. At first she thought that a large group of people was coming from the forest. She stopped reading and began to pay more attention to the sounds. They were getting louder and louder. She heard horses coming her way. She said it wasn't like one or two but a large group of what felt like 100 horses coming her way. She started to panic because it was getting dark and all she could hear was those awful horses' whinnies and people screaming. She closed her eyes and began to pray since she was a strong believer. She thought she was about to die. The sound was getting closer and closer and closer. The horses were getting faster, and she could hear men screaming in French just like in a battlefield. She felt eyes looking at her and people surrounding her. She closed her eyes, completely shook, and heard a tap on the window before hearing someone breathing in the car. Suddenly everything stopped. My uncle finally came back, and he asked her why she was so pale. She didn't tell him anything. She told him to get in the car, start the engine, and get the duck out of there as soon as possible. When he did as she told him to, she looked back to the empty field, and she told me that via the car's front light she saw horses print everywhere in the ground. She was really scared after this episode, and she took a long time before telling us this story. I still remember her eyes, full of terror, when she was telling us about the dead horses and their cursed riders. I am an avid catfisher. I love to fish at night when it is peaceful and quiet. And I tend to stay out extremely late on non-work nights. That leads me to why I was here at this lake, experiencing what I did. I forget what day it was, but I was alone. My girlfriend at the time didn't want to come with me, and I couldn't convince anyone to come with me. So I decided to go alone. I grabbed my gear and my gun and fished for a few hours. Caught a few. While I was fishing, I kept hearing people talking. I couldn't see anyone. I figured maybe they were just walking down the road. I play it no mind. Fast forward a few hours, this is a city lake, so it is decently lit up in most areas. I hear a whistle. I look around, I don't see or hear anything further. Resume fishing. Another whistle, this time to my right. I'm thinking to myself it is probably some kids, but this is an attention-seeking whistle. Like one that someone would do if they wanted your attention. Again, I see and hear nothing. I turn around, see a cat, and think nothing of it. I go back fishing. I hear another whistle, this time behind me. Cat's gone, I reel in my lines. Catfish are pretty strong, so I don't want to lose a $200 pole. I put my hand on my gun, and I quietly walk around the building. Nothing. I see and hear nothing. Which would be impossible since there is gravel everywhere. I turn around and walk back, and directly behind me I hear a very loud and shrill whistle. Enough to make me flip around and draw my gun. My heart is pounding, so I grab my shit and book it to my car. Fast forward a week later, last Friday or Saturday night. My friend and I go to the same place. I forget about the whistling. We go fishing, we have a decent time. As I was looking around, I kept noticing shadows in the trees across the lake. It was almost looking like something was running near the lights and jumping around. I don't think much of it, I figured it was the night playing tricks on me. My friend, who didn't tell me till later, also observed the exact same thing. Come close to 3 a.m. and I hear some people chatting. I don't see anyone, which was odd. The lake is kind of like a pit with roads all around, impossible to not see someone walking by. Despite my uncertainty, I continue to fish. Around 3:15 a.m., I begin to hear birds tweeting. This is dead of night. I turn to my friend, and I'm like, you hear the birds chirping? Kind of odd for 3 a.m. He looks around, kind of looking paranoid. 5 to 10 minutes later he says, those aren't birds chirping, someone is mimicking them. And I look at him, and I'm like, what are you on about? And he goes, remember that story you told me your coworker told you? I nod, yeah, about the incidents and why they don't let anyone swim here any longer? And he goes, how many people have died? As soon as he says that, the crickets stop, the wind dies immediately, the fish stop biting. My pole was being pulled in as he said that and it just slipped off, and you could hear a pin drop. Do you feel that? And I nod. My chest is feeling heavy and hard to breathe. A horrible feeling of dread. He looks around and says, bro, let's pack our shit and dip. I agree, and we grab half the junk and pack it up. The tweeting starts back up, we go back for the rest, and rush it to the car. He suddenly flips around with his knife drawn, and I pull my gun. And he says, "We need to go now." We get in and drive off, and I'm like, "What the duck did you pull your knife for?" And he deadass says, "Something was running behind me, like it was charging us." I don't know what happened. But even typing this out gives me chills. I don't believe in anything supernatural or paranormal. Ghosts, werewolves, whatever is considered paranormal or spooky. It scared the shit out of me. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. I can't explain it. Camping. It was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip, a calm one. It was the complete opposite. As I arrived at my campsite, I felt that something was off. It was a very secluded spot, but was usually filled with sounds of life. But on this evening, it seemed quieter than normal. No birds singing, no rustling leaves under the feet of mice and squirrels. It was almost completely silence. It was really creepy, but I wasn't going to turn back after just getting here. It was a 7-hour drive after all. So I set up my tent and my portable camping stove, and I set up a little campfire. I put my folding chair right next to it and dozed off. I must have been asleep for at least 2 hours, because when I woke up it was dark. I stood up and stretched, then went into the woods to take a piss. As I was doing my business, I heard a very strange noise from behind me. It was a sort of half growl, half laugh. I froze. I tried to calm myself. It's just a weird bird. Or a coyote. SHT, who was I kidding? I was absolutely terrified. I quickly zipped up my pants and stumbled through the dark to my campsite. I put out my fire and unzipped my tent. It was a small 2-person tent, but it suited me just fine. It was really dark, so I opened up my phone and turned on the flashlight. I nearly had a heart attack. Inside my tent, crouched down as if preparing to pounce, was a hairy little humanoid creature. It was shaped like a human but covered in coarse, matted, dirty fur. It smiled at me, its teeth are yellow and sharp. I was too scared to scream, and I stumbled out of the tent, sprinting back toward my truck. I got in and turned the key in the ignition. I backed out of my parking spot and sped off down the road. I was scared out of my mind, but at least I was leaving that awful place. I had only been driving for a couple of minutes when I heard something in the back seat of my truck. It was that same half growl, half laugh. I didn't even turn around. I slammed on the brakes, opened the door, jumped out, and ran. I ran and ran and ran until I was far, way away. I stopped to catch my breath. I turned around, and, thankfully, there was nothing behind me. I caught a ride back to my house, and the rest of the night passed without incident. State troopers called me the next day and said they found my truck on the side of the road. They asked if it had been stolen, but I didn't know what to tell them. I still think about that night today, and I have not been camping since. So I was born and raised near central Pennsylvania. I was a Boy Scout from 5th grade until my 18th birthday. This story takes place in the summer of 2007. My dad was the scoutmaster, and my brother was the campmaster for years at the camp where this story took place. Needless to say, scouting is in my blood, and I've always been engrossed in it. During weekend campouts, we would always play jailbreak, cops and robbers. One team, cops, tried to catch the other team, robbers, and bring them to a central point, the jail. Anyone on the robbers team that wasn't yet caught could run to the jail, touch it, and yell jailbreak. And release anyone inside. This continued until we caught all the robbers, at which point we switched teams. We would play from around 7 to 8 p.m. until 2 to 3 a.m. on Fridays and Saturdays. Now, for a week in the summer, our scout troop would go to a Boy Scout camp in Pennsylvania for a week to get merit badges to gain ranks and gain skills in scouting. Usually summer camp happens in late June to mid-July. I would also go to a church camp for a week in early June before scout camp. It was when I was getting picked up from church camp, knowing that scout camp was only a week or two out, that my dad took me aside. He told me that one of the kids, Brian, not his real name, was hit and killed by a driver who was texting and driving. The area we live in is rural. I guess Brian was walking just off the shoulder between his parents and grandparents when he was hit. It was a 35 miles per hour zone on a straight road, and the lady that hit him was going almost 55 miles per hour. To my knowledge, she was never charged with anything from the incident. We went to the viewing later that week and then summer camp the week after. During that week at summer camp, we were at one of the campsites located centrally in the camp. Each site was named after a Native American tribe. We were the only scout troop in the campsite, so we decided to play jailbreak. There were 8 of us playing that night. At the campsite there are bathrooms called kiabos that have 2 stalls and a urinal with a sink, all covered by a roof. This campsite in particular had a steep bank just on the far side of the Kiabo that you could lay down against and not really be seen in the dark from someone looking down the hill. So our whole team was laying against it, ready to run in all directions once found. We had someone watching behind us, uphill, and to our right as I watched our left. I noticed someone watching us from behind a tree. The tree was maybe 30 feet away from where we were lying. The person looked like they were wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up. They were peeking from behind the tree and ducking back in. I said, "Hey guys, is that someone looking at us?" Everyone looked. Then a flashlight from one of the adults swept across the bank and the tree as they walked around the campfire above us on the hill. As the light crossed the tree, I distinctly saw the tree shadow, and no person's silhouette connected to it. The person was peeking out and didn't seem to light up as the light crossed them. As we saw this, someone yelled, "Run! Run! Get the hell up!" We ran to the campfire, and the other players that were looking for us were already up at the fire, getting ready to search for us. Our friend was killed wearing a gray sweatshirt and was one of the best catchers in the game. I like to think that he was having one final game with us before he crossed over to wherever we go. Thanks for listening to my story. Back when I was younger, about in primary school, I went to a friend's house who was located just under a mountain. She lived on a big farm that backed into the woods. I'm pretty sure a bit of the woods was their land as it extended over their property lines. Anyway, we finish having dinner, and I go outside to get into the car so they can take me home. I didn't live far. Just then a terrifying duck and scream or roar echoes through the woods, reaching us. I shat myself, and my gut sank, and so did my friend's. Her father said it was just a deer hollering. Yes, it did sound like one, but it sounded often worse. Eventually we calmed down and got the hell out of there, thank God. I never went back. Fast forward a month, and the uncle, who loves hunting, took his 3 dogs and the dad out hunting. One of the dogs was horrifically killed with big gashes coming out of it. Before you say bear or mountain lion, I live in a country where we have none and the only things dangerous are wild boars. They said it was attacked by a wild boar, but it was destroyed, and wild boars don't do that much damage. Good thing to say I never went there again. I've graduated high school now, but that night always scares me, but I have one of my best campfire stories that gets my friends scared. I laugh about it now, but I will never ever want to go back and find that thing out there. So for about 6 months I rented out a basement from a family. I lived in another state for work. It was just convenient and cheap at the time and worked out for everyone. The basement was unfinished but had studs up where the walls would be, had heat, but a cement floor, and living in the northern part of the United States during the winter, it regularly got quite chilly at times down there. So much so that I had 2 space heaters to keep warm. The family who owned the house had quite a bit of stuff piled up in the basement as well. They were mild pack rats, not hoarder level, but you could tell they hadn't unpacked everything from their last move, bags and boxes and totes, and everything piled up. I had the one central area to myself where I had my bed, my TV was set up, a few chairs, and whatnot. It was like a small studio apartment. Anyways, I've had some paranormal experiences over my life. But this was on a new level. It began probably a couple months after I moved in. I started feeling, I dunno, uncomfortable, I guess is the best way to describe it, when I would go to bed for the night. I'm not usually one to be terrified of the dark, but I began to sleep with a light on in the next room over. Really the only separation between my room and the next were the wall studs. Uncomfortable, like I didn't feel okay in the dark and closing my eyes. I'm not sure, just weird, I guess. As weeks went on, as I would sit down there and play Xbox or watch TV when I was not working, I would see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, walking between the wall beams in the next room over. This was obviously concerning, but having had experiences before, I wouldn't say terrifying. Just like, oh, that's creepy. It was a fairly regular occurrence, maybe once or twice a week. Then the dream started. I had recurring nightmares about a female apparition, very scary looking with long, flowing dark hair. The dream always took place in a house I didn't recognize, and I knew the spirit was in there with me, but I didn't know where. It would always jump from behind a corner and scare the crap out of me, and I would try to run away from it, but I couldn't move fast enough, and just before it caught me, I would snap myself awake. Those were the worst parts of my experience there. I would wake up shaken and usually sweating and out of breath. Finally, I asked the homeowner if anyone had ever told her that there was something in her basement. I remember her face going pale a bit, and she told me that other people had reported things happening down there from time to time. There were some examples, but I don't recall what they were now. But I do remember that she told me she had some belongings down there that once belonged to her first husband. He had killed himself many years prior, but she had hung on to some of his stuff. I found my own place shortly after and moved out. The dreams immediately stopped, no more shadows, it totally stopped after leaving, thank God. This was a few years ago in SW, Connecticut. A few years ago, I was working a high school job in a local pizza place. The hours would run pretty late and I would bike home. It was a 15-minute bike ride. One day I finished my shift at around 10 p.m. and decided to hang out with one of my coworkers till around 11 or 12. I distinctly remember it being a weekday in around August or early September. I biked home around 75% of the way. This part of CT is quite urban and densely populated, but because it was a weeknight and I lived in a more suburban area, the roads were dead and I was the only person on the sidewalks. I was biking past a shopping center that had closed up for the night when I noticed across the street a group of people. There were 4 people forming a 2-person line. A person in the back was pulling a wagon with a trash bag in it that was filled with something. They were all fully veiled, 2 people were wearing all black veils, and 2 were wearing all white. They looked sort of dazed as well. They weren't looking forward while walking but instead looking slightly upwards. When I saw them, I was immediately perplexed. I actually stopped my bike and stared at them for like 30 seconds, which was a pretty idiotic move in hindsight. They didn't seem to notice me or react to me, they just walked on. The only rational explanation I had was that there was a Jewish center nearby. I'm not very educated on what traditional attire they wear, but I do believe that sometimes people wear full-body veils, maybe it had something to do with that. It was around 12 a.m., so even that explanation seems inadequate. The house on a hill. No one in Gentry knew much about the house on the hill. It was a large, 3-story colonial-style home that was said to have been built in the early 1800s. 7-year-old Jimmy didn't know too much about it, but he had heard his parents whispering about strange noises coming from the house when they thought that Jimmy couldn't hear them. His parents worried that someday the people at the sanatorium, as his parents said it when he wasn't there, or the bad place might go there. Jimmy didn't worry about it too much, he knew he was safe in Gentry. Jimmy and his parents lived across the street from the house on the hill, and he thought it was a strange, spooky-looking place. The first floor had been turned into a museum that no one went to, but the museum went out of business years ago. Every day riding his bike home from school, Jimmy had an uneasy feeling that someone was watching him from inside the house. It was almost like someone was calling Jimmy to go inside and look around. Jimmy was scared to tell his parents because he didn't want to go to the bad place. Jimmy's 8th birthday was coming up, and now that he was a big boy, he decided to face his fears and prove that there's nothing to be scared of. It's just a big old house, right? On his way home from school, instead of turning right into his driveway, he moved his handlebars left and heard the munching of the century-old gravel underneath his tires. The door would probably be locked, but Jimmy had to know. He crept up the rickety front porch stairs, threatening to fall into the seemingly endless space between his foot and the ground. He was almost at the front door. He reached his right hand to grab the doorknob, his eyes fixed on the knob like a dog looking at a treat. The door opened with a tremendous groan as the rusted hinges screamed in pain at Jimmy. He covered his nose in disgust as he was assaulted with decades of mold and a smell Jimmy had never been around before. He didn't know how to describe it to himself, almost a sweet odor that made his stomach turn upside down and give him mild nausea. He walked around the first-floor museum and saw black and white photos that looked older than his grandma. There were a lot of pictures about a lady that used to live there in the 1940s. The caption said that her husband went off to war and never came back. The caption said that she went crazy and went to the bad place. The stairs to the second floor were taped off. Jimmy felt drawn to them, he was being quite rebellious. His parents were going to be very disappointed when they found out where he'd been. Without thinking about it, Jimmy went underneath the tape and climbed the steep staircase. He had never seen a human body look that way before in ways Jimmy didn't know existed. Jimmy's heart was pounding, and he wanted to leave. As he took his first step backwards, he heard the soft click of a door locking and fast footsteps scurrying up the stairs. Our father shared these stories with me and my siblings. Me and my twin were 11 or 12 at the time, so I'll be going off memory. Anyway, my dad was a wild card when he was young and thought a spooky graveyard was the ideal date spot like most people back in those days. 1. The Bull's Lament. There was once a farmer who had a prized bull in life. The farmer loved the bull so much that when he died, he wanted the bull to be killed and buried beside him. He also wanted a statue of the proud bull placed over their graves to watch over them for all eternity. Most folk during that time thought the farmer was crazed for thinking of such a wish, yet that didn't stop them from honoring his wish. When the farmer passed, the bull was put down and placed right beside him. The monument was then placed over them just as the farmer wished. I'm not sure how many years went by until my dad's experience, so I apologize for not having any idea when it happened, possibly when he was in his early to mid-20s. My dad liked to hang out in the nearby graveyard with several of his friends. It was like their own playground where they could play army men and pranks. On one night in particular, he and one of my uncles were just relaxing until they heard it. The sound of a bull crying out either in anger or anguish. They looked at one another and decided to see where it came from. They followed the noise to the monument only to find nothing. It was then that they heard the bull roar somewhere nearby before the sound of charging hooves running toward them. Dad said they ran the hell out of the graveyard and back to their car. 2. The man in a top hat and cape. Another story my dad told me happened when he and one of my uncles took their dates to the graveyard. They parked their car in one of the turnoffs and proceeded to make their own lover's lane. Things were getting serious when one of their dates noticed a green fog begin surrounding the car. All four of them sat frozen, watching the mist grow even further in thickness. Soon, they began to hear strange thuds striking the car. It was then that Dad decided to turn the key and get out of there as soon as possible. He was then surprised to find a man dressed in a top hat and cape standing directly in front of their car, smiling at them. The thudding on the car began to become even worse, scaring the dates further. Dad hit the gas pedal and drove forward directly toward the man, hoping he would move out of the way. Instead of moving, the man stood still, allowing the car to drive through him. Dad stopped the car some distance past where the man stood and looked through the back window. To his surprise, he saw the man still standing there unharmed with the same grin. The man began to gesture for Dad to try again, but Dad decided to just drive out of there for several miles in silence. One late summer night, at about 1:30 in the morning, I sat outside and alone in the quiet mountain night. In the distance, I could hear crickets chirping and bullfrogs groaning from the nearby pond at the golf course. The moon hung lazily in the sky, a waxing gibbous, shedding its silvery light on the tall pine trees that surrounded me in the small, fenced-in backyard where I was. Suddenly, in the distance, I heard this loud, strange sort of gurgled-sounding animal call. Some friends and I had heard it before at night, but all we knew about it was that it made a coyote come tearing out of the bushes to get away from it one time. It was like nothing that any of us had ever heard before, and we'd all lived up here for years. Anyways, like I said, I heard this weird, scary-sounding animal announce its strange gargled bark-like cry off in the distance, presumably far away from me. At least I thought so anyway. But then, not even 1 minute later, without a sound of approach to be heard, the loud, scary, gurgle-sounding bark sounded like it came just a few feet away from me in the night. I straight up bolted upright and started to run the 50 feet or so to the back door of the house, practically knocking the flimsy white plastic pogo chair I was sitting in back into the fence. I remember thinking about looking back to see what the hell it was as I ran, but I thought, hell no, it'll slow me down to look back, and besides, I don't want to know what the hell it is. It took me almost a full minute to get the nerve to peek out the back window in the door to see what it was after I burst in. But, by the time I did look, there was absolutely nothing, and unfortunately, none of us ever figured out what the hell that creature was. My Navajo grandfather's account of the sleeping grounds. My grandfather Winter escaped his reservation during America's first Great Depression when he was 15. He wandered west, working odd jobs and riding the lumber trains. Winter made friends with people we would call hobos today and was a shameless self-proclaimed hobo. He said their brotherhood of hobos looked after each other better than governments or families could. They pooled money to have small parties for the holidays, they made sure no one went hungry, and they whistled like birds to discreetly wake each other if one saw a railroad bull coming. Even years later, my grandfather would snap out of a nap if a bird sung nearby. The brotherhood got off in Washington to work a few weeks as hands at a logging camp before continuing to Canada. That is where Winter encountered the sleeping grounds. It was early December, and daytime temps in the mountains never rose above freezing. After hiking all day, the Hobo Brotherhood discovered that the logging camps they intended to work at were abandoned last spring, and all that was left were the sleeping skeletons of a few log cabins. It was almost dark by the time they arrived, so they decided to scavenge for loose materials to build a temporary shelter for the night. My grandfather was part of the group sent to go into the woods to look for firewood. Winter did not have much luck finding anything beyond a few twigs in the stripped woods around the camp and was forced to go deeper into the woods to take advantage of what little daylight he had left. But Winter became lost almost as soon as he went into the woods. He was from New Mexico and had no experience hiking in mountain forests. He yelled for help, but his words seemed muffled. He saw only one thing in the darkness, a campfire. Winter went to it and discovered a clearing with an open canvas tent and a bed made of animal fur. My grandfather spared no detail describing the beautiful, nude native woman lying on animal skins by the fire. She told Winter to undress and get into bed with her. My grandfather, being 18 at this time, did so before she finished speaking. My grandfather said that those moments resting by the woman next to the roaring fire were the most serene and peaceful of his life. Then he heard a bird sing. It was the hobo's warning call, something rooted deeply in Winter's unconsciousness by now. Winter doubted that anything else could have reached him from the sleeping grounds, not even gunshots. My grandfather woke up at dawn, half buried in a snow bank with frostbite over half his body. He looked around to see his friends frantically whistling, trying to wake him before he fell asleep permanently in the snow. They found Winter in a field of animal and human bones. All of the still intact skeletons were in sleeping positions. The little girl in the forest. My mom grew up in Laos when she was a kid. She would often go gardening with her mom a few miles away from her home. One time, my grandma told her to go back home and drop off the basket of crops and come back. After my mom got home and was heading back to the field, she said she saw a little girl by herself in the forest she passed. My mom went to ask if she was lost, but the little girl didn't say anything. My mom offered her to come to the field and see if grandma could help her find her parents. My mom said the little girl followed her, but at a distance behind. When my mom got closer to the field, the little girl would get closer to my mom and was eventually walking right behind her. When my mom reached grandma, she told the little girl to wait. My mom went to ask grandma if she could help the little girl find her parents, but grandma responded, "What little girl?" And my mom looked right at the little girl, wondering why grandma couldn't see her. My mom pointed in the direction of the little girl, and grandma slapped her hand, telling her that pointing is bad. My mom said the little girl just watched her pick crops where she stood. When grandma was finished with the crops, she told my mom to get ready to go home. My mom asked grandma if she could bring the lost little girl, but grandma ignored my mom and didn't acknowledge the little girl. My mom felt awful and was confused, but as they walked back home, the little girl followed them at a distance again. When they got to the forest where my mom found the little girl, my mom told grandma that's the forest she discovered her in. My mom said grandma grabbed her arm, and they walked really fast home. My mom said there was a little girl who went missing in their village, and she thought that little girl was just a ghost because the little girl was nowhere to be found. The locals went looking into the forest but couldn't find anyone. But my mom said she would often see the little girl near the field when they go gardening. As she got older, the little girl was still little. She eventually disappeared when a shaman at my mom's village had to bless my mom because it was causing her distress that this little girl was lost and no one was helping her find her family. I found something in the woods. I live in white suburbia, and I used to take walks every day for my health. I'll admit I'm pudgy, but I'm working on that. Now, these walks mainly consisted of going around my neighborhood, but one day, I decided to poke around in the woods behind my house. The trek was difficult, but I'm young, and I'd like to imagine myself as capable of jumping over a ditch. The walk consisted of traversing a winding path through the thicket and then going across a narrow waterway. The sides were steep, but I could have easily walked into it and climbed out the other side if I didn't mind getting my shoes and pants legs wet. Then, I crossed an abandoned railroad track and jumped another ditch before finally making it to the woods. The woods were in this sort of V shape, as in the area gets wider as you traverse. I was approaching where it started to widen out when I found this pit. It was more like a dugout. It was shallow and had some bricks in a circle in the middle and lining the edge. I later found out that the guy and his buddies who made the area went to my school. The trees leading up to the dugout had spray paint on them, I guess acting as trailblazers. That was weird to me. There was only one path to follow in the woods, so you'd basically have to run into the pit on your way deeper. I didn't pay much mind to it at the moment, however. I started walking further into the trees until I found a pond. I wasn't trying to get bit by mosquitoes, so I gave it a wide berth. But that's when I heard it, flute music. It's hard to describe years later, but it was high-pitched and beautiful. I was entranced. I started following the music with a smile on my face. I took only a couple of steps before they showed themselves. Figures glowing bright white were running in a straight line. They were sprinting diagonally towards me, and I'm not proud to admit that I started crying out of fear. I called my father immediately as I ran back towards the train tracks. He picked up on the third ring right as the tracks were in view, and I'm ultimately thankful for the spray-painted trailblazers, as I probably would have gotten lost in my panic without them. I blubbered to my father about the people in the woods, and we eventually met up on the outskirts of the thicket. I haven't gone back since, and I still have no idea what those things were. My little scary, paranormal experience. We were in our first home in Switzerland. It was a few years ago already, but I can still remember it well. The apartment on the second floor, where we lived, was rented by a landlord that owned the 3-story wooden house, as they are typically built around the area, while we lived on the first floor. He was an old man. He was over 80 years old, and his health condition wasn't the best. Sometimes during the night, we could even hear him on the floor beneath how he screamed the name of his wife, who died long ago. As a 10-year-old kid, that scared me. Safe to say was that during the day he behaved normally and really liked to hear a specific channel on his radio. Unfortunately, after a few months, the landlord passed away from natural causes. We have been good friends with him. Sometimes he would give me some cookies and other presents to my parents, and we returned with other gifts as well. It was a little sad at first, but we quickly let it pass and kept on with our lives. After his death, weird things started happening. During the night while trying to sleep, we all heard footsteps on the upper floor, which was locked, with no one living there. This strange scene would happen frequently from then on. Our horror was just starting, as we couldn't find any explanation for what was happening. But then the most terrifying moment of my life happened. I couldn't get to sleep with those footsteps over my head, so at midnight I decided to go to the living room to see if they would stop there. They did, but something worse happened. We had those big boxy televisions that we all know. That television had normal TV channels but also a radio mode, where you could only play live radio. A feature we had never used. I sat in front of it, on the sofa, and then, without a single person touching the remote on the table, the television turned on, and that's not it. It was in that radio mode. For the final spooky touch, it was on the exact channel our landlord listened to on his radio. My first reaction was a scream, which woke my parents, making them come to the living room. They too were shocked with what happened. This moment was the end for us. We couldn't stand these unexplained sounds above anymore, and that paranormal event chilled us to our bones. We decided to move out and leave. After that, nothing else happened to us. What if it was the landlord's ghost? Is he still there? We will never know. All these stories supposedly happened at the camp. Keep in mind that when I went to the camp had been around for 50 years, and as of today, they are celebrating their 60th year anniversary. I won't be talking about all the stories that I was told by my camp counselors because I know a lot of them are just outright false. So I will talk about the ones I either know happened or 100% believe happened. Sandbog. Sandbog is an acronym that stands for strangers are near, be on guard. If that doesn't just make you feel scared, what if I were to tell you that the KKK came up with it as a code for something? I assume it is an overall warning for the members of the KK, but in the context of this story, I think it was a warning to the camp. Back in the camp's earlier history, back when the KK were still a little more active, there was an incident where while camp was happening someone had come onto the property and had defaced the road that leads up to the trading post in big letters writing out Sandbog. Apparently, it was concerning enough to the owner at the time that they probably shouldn't continue doing camp because it caused the year to be cancelled after fearing for the safety of both the staff as well as the other campers. Hatchet Man. This story is a little bit more recent, but not by much. Camp Deer Run has a lot of stories regarding people just living out on the property illegally. And it's quite possible that they are easily able to access the property considering there is just a large stretch of the property void of trees because of it being part of a pipeline system for some reason. That being said, this story is about the encounters of a man known as a Hatchet Man. Now I know that our camp counselor would embellish this story, saying the man killed a dog on the property, but that is just not true. What stories I do believe are these. The Hatchet Man was first seen after a group of campers had ended one of their day activities for rec time. That activity would be going to a swing out in the middle of the woods, where they would have fun braving the swing, all that jazz. Basically, the swing had this platform where they would get onto it and such. I think they had to wear helmets for safety because after they had their fun they started to head back, and one of the kids realized he had left his hat. He asked his counselor if he could go back and get it. The counselor said yes, and the kid goes back to the part of the property that had the swing and finds a man holding a hatchet and sharpening it with a rock. The man looks up at him and grabs his hat, asks him if it was his hat, and gives it back to him. The kid returns and asks his counselor who the man he saw was. And the counselor said there was not supposed to be anyone there. There are more stories of Hatchet Men, but I want to move on. The most recent story I know actually happened around when I was going to the camp. The story goes that Ty Ford, the camp director and owner, was managing the property one day and was encountered by a stranger. The stranger walks up to him and starts talking to him. And the stranger tells him that he enjoys hearing the singing that happens at the camp. The significance of that statement is important because that means the man was so close to camp he might as well be on the main grounds. In the woods or something. Living there, the camp is a church camp, and every night we sing underneath the pavilion. It's this old wooden structure that has been there since the camp started. The fact that the man said he enjoyed hearing us sing makes me feel chills up my spine. I have walked through those woods alone before. I know how huge the property is, and that's because we have themed days, and on one of the days we are forced to go out and hunt for our main camp counselors in the woods, not knowing where they are. We are supposed to stay as a group, but me being stupid and young, I thought I would go and try finding him myself. I looked all over the place, and when I got back, everyone had already found the counselor, and everyone was already lined up for lunch. That's just how big the camp is. I even found the old swing where the original hatchet man came from. I say this because I know the property is big enough to have people who aren't supposed to be there living on it. Something lives deep in the woods where I grew up. Most people only talk about it in hushed whispers, nervously glancing over their shoulders. The rest use it as a cautionary tale, warning their children not to venture too deep into the trees there. My parents were the latter. They used the legend as a way to keep me out of the forest behind our house. I always got a laugh from their warning. I knew things like that didn't exist. Yet they would swear by it. The patchwork man walks tonight. He'll steal your children and taint their souls. Yeah, right. Tell me another one. I wasn't a naive child. I was a street-smart teenager. They couldn't fool me with their fairy tales and lies. It didn't matter that they wove tales of an entity so depraved that not one adult would set foot near the forest at night. The fact he was said to slip past lit windows searching for his next victims to play with didn't bother me. It wasn't real. A creature who stole the flesh from children's bones wasn't something that existed. It was only a campfire story, nothing more. So I decided to prove them all wrong. Everyone told me not to look for him. I was only inviting danger because once he set his sights on you, nothing would stop him. I didn't listen. I had to prove to them how wrong they were. Now I know the truth. I was the one who was wrong. Everything you have heard about the patchwork man is true. He is your worst nightmare, personified. The stories people tell are but a pale reflection of what he truly is. I know this. I know it very well. I'm now one of the damned who lingers in these woods, my life snuffed out by he who dwells within. I issue this warning: lock your doors, keep your lights on, and hold your children close. The patchwork man walks tonight. So I was maybe 16 to 17, and I had stayed at my aunt's house, Dad's sister, and she lives like 2 doors down from my dad's. Well, her grandchildren, my cousins, decided to have a sleepover at her house. The next morning I get up and it's dreary outside, but it's also winter, and I look at my oldest cousin and tell him I'm going to walk to the house and change my clothes so we can go outside and do whatever. We usually play ball in the graveyard across the road. He says okay, and I head to the house. As I get to the driveway, I see someone standing in front of the balcony doors inside the house, and then I stop walking because no one is home. My dad and stepmother were both at work. So then the person disappears, like they just stepped back to where I couldn't see them anymore. I remember the person was the shape of a woman who had on this long white gown and dark hair. So now my anxiety is through the roof. I see my cousin start to head my way, and I keep walking towards the house because I thought by the time I get the door unlocked, he'll be here and it will all be good. Psych. We had a golden retriever outside, and when I opened the door, I called for her to come inside with me, but once she got to the door, she tucked her tail between her legs and wouldn't go any further. So that freaked me out. I grabbed her by her collar to try and gently tug her, telling her to come in the house that it was cold. She fought me and eventually ran down the stairs. My cousin is at the end of the driveway and yells for me to hurry up, and I'm tempted to just say duck it and stay in my pajamas, but I leave the door open and run to my room, thinking if the door is open, I'm good. So I run through the kitchen, into the dining room, the living room, and then the hallway to my room on the far right. I could have just gone through the kitchen and then to my room, but the den always creeps me out. So I get to my room and strip off my pajamas as fast as I can, put on some jeans, and grab a long sleeve shirt. As I put the shirt on, I hear running down the hallways with loud footsteps coming towards me, and I go to scream, but nothing will come out. So I go running out of my room and back the way I came and have my shirt halfway on by the time I run outside. My cousin is now under the carport and asks me, "What's wrong?" I tell him something is in my house, and he's like, "What do you mean?" So I finish getting my shirt on and go to turn around to close the door and freeze. He asks what's wrong. I point to the kitchen window, which is beside the door, and through the kitchen window you see not only the kitchen but the den too. The den light was on. I look back at him and tell him that I didn't turn it on because I never go through there. So he starts getting freaked out, and he stands beside me on the step. The running came again toward us, and he cleared the steps. So I'm standing there feeling like I'm frozen and not being able to move. I remember him telling me to come on, and I tell him that I have to turn off that light because my stepmother will literally cuss me out, she was abusive. So I run inside and have him watch me, and as I go to hit the light switch, I see a dark figure on the wall in front of me, and then it disappears. I run out of the house and slam the door. I tried to tell my stepmother, but she thought I was crazy and none of that stuff was real. Still to this day, hearing running in horror movies from ghosts where it's loud and stuff causes the hair on my body to stand up. A stranger in the forest. At the campfire, I used to tell stories to my friends. Horror stories. They were about crazy axe killers, bloodthirsty bears, and vengeful ghosts. Seeing the fear in their eyes at night and then their exhausted faces in the morning were my greatest pleasure. In the forest, you could go and do whatever. That's why I built a cottage. And after spending weeks alone among cawing birds and dark pine trees, I never took horror stories seriously. Until today. On the hill stood a stranger, covered with mud and fir needles. I almost mistook it for a tree, but I felt the glare directed at me, unavoidable, judgmental, intense. I grabbed my hatch. "Lost your way?" I asked with a fake smile. "Do you need help?" It was a woman, black or red hair. She ignored my questions, her mouth open in an empty cry. The tree behind her creaked, but she kept herself motionless and never let me out of sight. I swallowed and scrambled over the shrub up the hill. What did she want? Although I moved closer, she gave no answers. But I recognized her red face. A hiker from the area. I forgot her name, but I remembered the fear in her eyes. I didn't know what was worst, the fact that someone dug her body up or that they hung her from a branch to show me. The birds were silent, the pine trees like strangers. Was the forest always this foreign? The mountain. As I diverge further up the mountain, I gaze longingly at the immensely mesmerizing landscape, drawing me into a trance as I marvel at its placid serenity, uncorrupted by man's wrath. I am disconnected from this nature's stupor by the sound of the remaining climbing crew only now reaching the summit of this luxurious mount. I let out a sigh of sorrow in my unfamiliar nostalgia, contaminated as I ignored the predictable utterances of some view, ain't it? And everything looks like ants from up here. Disheartened and disappointed, I began to set up my tent as some others have, the buoyancy of the mindless crowd provoking me into bitterness. I am repulsed by every joyous action I overhear, as I conceal my rage, silently hammering each peg into place, reaching their final destination in the cold, muddy ground. As my efforts reach an all-time low, my boundless depression is only exasperated by the sound of rain, willingly prancing from a pitter-patter to a fully functioning storm. As my day is further tainted, I reluctantly sit in the cold confines of my tent, withdrawing myself from the remainder of the crowd, all bastardized by the clutches of society, trying in vain to escape its grasps by booking their very own camping trip for the weekend. Exhausted by their selfish misdemeanor, I fall asleep, lulled into a slumber by the thunderous drumming of the rain on my tent. I awake, unsure of the time or how long I've slept, only shocked into consciousness by the fact the storm had ceased. I open my tent. Hell is unleashed. A creature, over 20 feet in height, stood adjacent to the campfire, unfazed by the spreading flames, as it sank its pearlescent white teeth into the group leader. Its millions of eyes darted frantically, its scaled skin emitting a pale glow, its feigned divinity causing others to stop and stare, only to be crushed beneath its mammoth figure. My heart sank as I locked eyes with it, seeing the furious beauty contained within this glorious shape. I find myself unable to move, fully conscious, as my body unwillingly stumbles toward its heavenly presence. Finally, I see it smile as I'm swallowed into the hopeless abyss of its stomach. The next day, the camping crew left. Someone had noticed the man had not been seen for hours. Upon investigation, what they saw was uncanny. A lifeless corpse, a sickening grin twisted onto the shell of the human that once lay there, its eyes removed, their location unknown. Whatever had done this to the man, the camping crew didn't want to find out. A few years ago, fall/early winter of 2019, we were staying with my husband's father. We rented/moved into a house a couple of months later, but had been staying there less than a week at the time this happened. I slept in the living room, on an air mattress, with our kids, ages 10, 5, and 1. The kitchen, dining room, and living room were all open space. There was a wide counter and sink that was a bar on the living room side. He never had stools or used it like that though. Always had a sofa pushed right up to it and had storage for dishes and whatever on the kitchen side. On each end of that counter, there was about 4 or 5 feet of open space between it and the wall. Along the wall directly opposite the front door were 3 doors, the father-in-law's bedroom, bathroom, and spare room, from left to right. My husband slept on the tiny spare bed. His dad kept the door to his room closed and usually had a TV and, depending on the weather, either a space heater, window AC unit, or at least one fan going. I don't remember if my husband had the door to the room he was sleeping in open or closed that night. Except for that back wall, where the bedrooms and bathroom were, the house had windows all the way around it. Large floor-to-ceiling windows along the front and a line of large, sliding windows along each side wall. It was originally built as a sort of camp/getaway cabin. Windows equals view. Apparently, he disagreed and was in the process of building a front porch and replacing about half of those windows with a wall. However, at the time, the porch was still being built, and none of the windows had been changed or taken out yet. This particular night, I was holding my 18-month-old, with a child on each side of us. We had all been asleep for a while when I woke up. I'm not sure what time it was, but the house was mostly quiet and no one else was awake. I lay there, quietly, without moving around, for a little while and couldn't figure out why I was awake at all, much less alert. Not long after I decided it was just one of those things. Sleep cycles. Blah blah blah, and was about to try to go back to sleep. Someone knocked on the front door. Not a loud banging, beating knock, but definitely a knock. The air mattress was in the middle of the living room area, and the door was on the kitchen side of that dividing counter. I really didn't want to answer the door for multiple reasons. I was in the middle of 3 sleeping children, it was late, it was cold, and we were cozy and warm all snuggled together. It wasn't my house/company, and no one else seemed to notice someone was knocking. The knocking went on for longer than I would have knocked on someone's door in the middle of the night and did get more persistent, though it never did turn into banging. No one called out for somebody to answer the door, and no one's cell rang. Finally, I heard someone walking down the unfinished porch. They had stacked some boards and tools and stuff against the front of the house. I heard no clatters or thumps or anything like that, but it did sound like whoever was out there was having to walk on and around those building materials. And then I heard a distinct and firm tapping on the window closest to the kids and me. There was a small, older TV and a small stereo/speaker sitting on 2 small tables, about nightstand size. Actually, the one holding the TV was an old nightstand I had given him years before, between the air mattress and the windows. I was facing away from the window, but the tapping was right there where our heads were. An entire wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, and the tapping was done only in the area that would have been in my direct line of sight if I hadn't been facing the other direction. I don't think I took a single breath until it stopped and I heard footsteps walking away. And they walked across the tin. All the way to the end of the porch, where the driveway was. Walking across sheets of tin makes a pretty distinct sound. I know exactly what it sounds like when someone walks on tin. What I did not realize until the next morning was that the only sheets of tin out there were already in place because they had finished putting it up as a roof over the porch before stopping for the evening, which meant that there were no sheets of tin stored against the wall/under the windows with those boards and tools and whatever else was there. The only way for someone or something to have walked across those sheets of tin, which I am certain, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that I heard happening after hearing an unknown someone knock and tap for so long it became unsettling rather than annoying, would have been for them to jump or swing up onto the top of the house or porch from an incomplete porch floor and then jump back down at the end. It scares me in a way nothing else ever has and still does every single time I accidentally think about it. And that's why I'm typing this right now, and probably also why an owl chose just now to let loose the most terrifying, unowl-like sound before transitioning into its usual eerie owl sounds. Tell me a scary story. Can you tell me another scary story tonight? Another one? Jimmy, you're much too young to be hearing spooky tales every night. But the other stories you've told weren't really scary. I want a real scary story tonight. Oh really? Okay, you little punk, no pumping the brakes on this one. But no waking me up if you're scared. Deal? Deal. Okay, I think I've got a good one. So once there was a woman, and she was very lonely. An accident had occurred when she was young and left her skin severely burned and deformed. All she wanted in life was a loving partner and the ability to have a child. She wanted a child more than anything. This story doesn't sound very scary at all. Well, if you interrupt, I can't really get to the scary part. Now where was I? Ah yes, a woman, and she had really bad skin. People would call her names like Freddy Krueger. Ha ha ha. Oh, that's funny, huh? Well, just wait until you hear the rest. So the woman knew that she would never be able to find a man to love her and give her a child, so she would have to find another way. She began going out at night and peering through the neighborhood windows, looking for the perfect child. Then one fateful night she glanced through a large window, kind of like the one here in your room. And she spotted the perfect little boy. It looked like my window. Yes, perhaps it was your window. And so that night she managed to get the window open and quietly snuck in to grab the boy. Let's call him Jimmy. You can stop the story now, I don't want. Oh no, We're just getting to the scary part. So she went to grab little Jimmy, but then she heard the doorknob turn. It was the boy's mom, so she quickly ran and hid in the closet. As she peered through the small crack in the closet and saw the mother lovingly tucking the small child in, she began to feel enraged. It just wasn't fair that this woman was able to enjoy what she had always coveted in life. So, what happened? So the woman couldn't control her anger any longer. She lunged from the closet and began attacking the mother. She managed to grab the lamp off the nightstand and began bashing. She then scooped little Jimmy out of bed and brought him back home to be with her. And they lived happily ever after. Mommy, that story was too scary. What if that woman comes through my window at night? Aw, honey, it was just a scary story. And I promise that I won't let anybody take you away. I was spending the night in a hotel in Oklahoma City that is known for having ghosts that terrorize NBA players on opposing teams. The hotel was built in the early 1900s and said to be haunted by the ghost of a maid called Effie. Legend says that Effie had a relationship with the hotel's founder, W.B. Skirvin. When it was discovered that she was with a child, he locked her in a room on the top floor. Distraught, Effie plummeted from the hotel window. The hotel has an interesting history, all in all, having been known as a speakeasy during Prohibition. It has also been the host of many famous and interesting faces through the decades. It was closed for over a decade, fell into disrepair, only to become an urban exploring hotspot before being completely renovated and reopened. Guests have reported unexplained noises, objects moving unexpectedly, and even being touched by something, or someone, unseen. As for me and my experience, I had a lovely evening, including dinner at the hotel restaurant and an after-dinner drink in the piano bar. We went back to the room, settled in, and fell fast asleep with no problems. At some point in the night, I had a dream that someone was in the room, moving around. It was just this dark shadow, slowly going across the room. In my dream, I just watched it move. Then I woke up. When I awoke, the room was dark, but there was also a dark figure of a person literally standing beside the bed, right next to me. It was clearly a human form just standing there. I thought maybe I was still dreaming at first, but I was too conscious, you know? It wasn't like being in a dream state. I reached out to see if anything was actually there. I grabbed onto what looked like this thing's left arm and pulled on it. This thing fell onto the bed, right across my upper legs. I could literally feel the weight of this figure on me. I start to yell out and bolt upright in bed, trying to push this thing off of me. My so wakes up in a panic, wondering what's wrong, and the thing is gone. I almost, maybe, would have chalked it up as sleep paralysis, which I have never experienced, but aside from the hotel's haunted history and other guests' experiences, my so said he was hearing noises through the night as though someone was moving through the room. Maybe it was Effie? Maybe it was someone or something else. But I wasn't able to fall asleep again that night until the sun started to rise and those little bits of light started coming in through the closed curtains. A walk in the woods. The woods seemed to be alive, the dark seemed to breathe. Every noise enhanced tenfold. Clara was terrified, exhausted, and cursing herself for getting off the trail. She had been walking for hours, the campsite was nowhere to be found. I must have gotten turned around. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself for some measure of comfort. The tears flowed freely. This whole day started off well. She decided to walk in the woods she had never been in. It was far too late when she realized she was lost. Branches and twigs kept snapping in every direction. She knew she wasn't alone. It's just an animal, breathe, it will be okay. Clara said out loud, trying to squash the feeling of impending doom that was rising like hot bile in her throat. Goose flesh rose on her pale skin. She picked up her pace. She was never good with directions, but she was sure she was moving north. At least she hoped. But hope drained as the hours went by. She came to a familiar-looking rock and came to the realization she had been walking in a circle for hours. She decided to move in the opposite direction. It was completely dark at this point, and Clara could barely see in front of her. She seemed to stumble over every rock and stick. Snap, snap. Crackle, then a laugh that was so inhuman it was sickening. A screech that made the blood run icy cold. Clara started running in full force. Then, out of nowhere, she lost her footing, tripping and smacking her head on a rock. She was out instantly. When she came, she knew she wasn't alone. She heard ragged breathing and smelt the stench of death. It was thick, she could almost taste it. She saw a black figure, crawling on all fours, whose straggly long hair obscured its face. It was coming up quickly for her. Clara screamed, managed to get to her feet, and was disoriented. But she was able to run, so she kept going. Her legs were screaming, and her lungs were burning. Survival is her only thought. Then she saw the outline of the edge of the woods. She could make out campfires lit in the distance. She was so close, she knew she could escape the grasp of this inhuman entity. She could feel it so very close, but Clara was fast. She had run track in college. Just 100 meters. Her brain screamed. Finally reaching the end of the trail, she felt it. The being wrapped its claws around her ankle, and Clara dropped face first to the forest floor. Blood and streaming tears on her face. Clara screamed for a final time. Then she belonged to the creature. A ghost story passed around my village since the 1940s concerns Old Monastery Pool. There is a place near my village that I am too afraid to visit at night. They say Old Monastery Pool is haunted and that this is the story that proves it. Just after the Second World War and with rationing still firmly in place, trading any extra food you grew or caught was a near necessity. A youth in my tiny Nottinghamshire village known only as Young Charlie understood this well. Back in those days, young Charlie could often be found in the Burl Arms. I actually live there now, trading the trout and eels he'd plucked from local streams for ration stamps. I suppose you know about Old Monastery Pool, one patron asked as he exchanged a few stamps for one of Charlie's slender trout. Charlie shook his head. Never heard of it, sir. Plenty of big fish in Old Monastery Pool, lad, the patron continued. Used to be the Monk's Carp Pond. They reared 'em for food hundreds of years ago. It's up in Glover's Wood. Trees moved in once the monastery was gone, but the pond's still there. Charlie's interest piqued. Really? Have you ever fished there? Me? Nah. You need Alsop's permission, otherwise, it's poaching, and me and him don't get on. Mr. Alsop was a local landowner, Charlie knew. But, whilst Mr. Alsop apparently had grievances with this man, Charlie had never gotten on the wrong side of him. How come you know there's plenty of fish if you've never fished there? Must be, answered the patron, after a long swig of ale, else why'd Alsop have refused all the folk who have asked to fish it? He's keeping all the carp for himself. Miserable bugger. The next Sunday morning, there was only one thing on young Charlie's mind. Church was the only place he ever saw Mr. Alsop, and so that was where he'd get his permission. Old Monastery Pool was full of ancient monster carp, and Charlie was desperate to catch one. Mr. Alsop, Charlie asked after the service, is it true that there's an old carp pond up in your woods? True enough, young man, Mr. Alsop answered, as they walked up the narrow church path. It belonged to the old monastery before it was burned down. Why do you ask? I was wondering if I might have your permission to fish it, sir. I'd return any fish I caught, of course, unless you wanted me to bring them down to the manor. I don't think so, Mr. Alsop answered dismissively. Now, I'd best be off, lots to do. Charlie was devastated. Fishing was his life, but he'd never had the chance to land anything truly remarkable before. A monster carp would be his crowning achievement and would have the pub talking for years. The next Sunday, Charlie beseeched Mr. Alsop again but got the same answer. So he tried again the following Sunday and was still refused. The Sunday after that, he offered to do odd jobs around the manor to pay for his fishing. The Sunday after that, he offered all the trout and eels he caught for a month. But, still, Mr. Alsop would not relent. Charlie tried and tried, Sunday after Sunday, never giving up. Eventually, he started calling in on Mr. Alsop at the manor itself. Lord, not you again, Mr. Alsop moaned when Charlie visited the manor for the third time in as many days. I'm just desperate to fish Old Monastery Pool, Charlie said, before Mr. Alsop had the chance to usher him away. Please, just say yes, and I'll stop coming here. I'll never ask anything of you again, I promise. The answer is no. I've told. Why won't you let me? Charlie exclaimed. Why are you being such a grouch? Because of the abbot, Mr. Alsop barked back. When he refused, starving villagers carp after a failed harvest, they strangled him and burned down the monastery to try and cover up the murder. He still. I don't care about some dead old abbot, Charlie interrupted. I just want one chance to fish the pond. Please, Mr. Alsop, please. Fine, Mr. Alsop answered, throwing his hands in the air, but don't come crying to me when. But Charlie didn't hear the end of what Mr. Alsop had to say because he was already running back towards his house. As soon as he had his fishing tackle, young Charlie raced across the local fields toward Glover's Wood. What he found in the dying light disappointed him. The pond was easy enough to find, but it was clogged with pond weed and full of dead branches. Only a few patches of clear water remained, and Charlie thought he could see through them right to the bottom. It seemed that the water was only a few inches deep, hardly the sort of place that might harbor a monster fish. But he had come this far. Charlie chucked out a little stick float and worm, hoping that there might still be a few minnows around, maybe even an eel or two. Almost as soon as his float stood straight in the water, it was yanked under with all the ferocity of a colossal pike strike. Charlie's line snapped instantly, but he didn't care. There was obviously something huge lurking in the pond. Maybe there was deeper water below the weed after all, the perfect hiding place for the giant carp he'd hoped would be there all along. Charlie wound in his loose line, sank back against a tree, reached into his basket, and began switching to his most robust tackle. But, in his eagerness, he couldn't resist a glance back up at the pond. Standing on the other side of the bank amongst the trees, the sinister shape of an old man dressed in tattered, soot-stained robes. He said nothing. He just stared at Charlie through unforgiving, bloodshot eyes. Terrified, young Charlie shot up from where he was sitting and slammed his head straight into a low branch, knocking himself out. Night engulfed young Charlie when he came around. He remembered where he was, what had happened, and, his heart racing, sat straight to squint through the gloom. No sign of any old man, but, to his horror, the fishing tackle by his side was smashed to pieces. Young Charlie stood and ran without retrieving so much as a broken float. The above is a story that is endlessly passed around campfires where I grew up. Most of my local ponds are inhabited by mirror carp, and, apparently, they're all descended from carp the monks used to rear in their monastery pond hundreds of years ago. According to local legend, the monastery was burned down when a cruel abbot refused fish to starving villagers after a failed harvest. In doing so, the abbot brought death and a terrible curse upon himself. Now he's doomed to patrol old monastery pool day and night, making sure no villagers try to take his precious fish. I have visited old monastery pool in the daytime, and I can report that it is weedy, murky, and surrounded by twisted trees and thorny undergrowth. It is certainly an eerie, unsettling place. I don't mind admitting that I was too creeped out by the pool to stay for very long. On top of that, I've always been too scared to visit at night or to throw in a fishing line like young Charlie did. In fact, I don't know of anyone in the village who's ever fished the pond or been up there at night. However, even with the cautionary tales and all the whispers of curses and ghostly abbots, I still wonder what might happen if I did. The Cedar Closet. We moved from the city to a big house in a quiet suburban neighborhood when I was 5. My parents bought the house from the widow of a very successful garment industry executive. He had the house custom built for his wife, and she had the entire thing professionally decorated, where every room was a different theme. This made for a very interesting childhood with lots of discoveries. Within a few days of moving in, my parents found 2 very strange books hidden in the crawl space above their closet. The first was a small address book with the names and addresses of prominent Jewish gangsters from the 40s and 50s. The other was a notebook containing detailed information on animals, mainly dogs and cats. Maybe they were someone's pets? But my mother felt it had to do with sacrifice, as there were pentagrams drawn and incantations written with dates. Both books were burned in the fireplace by my father shortly after uncovering them. Those things are unrelated to this story but just a very strange detail of the home we grew up in. This story isn't about me either, it's about my older brother, whom we'll call Jay. He is the oldest of 3 and 6 years my senior and 4 years older than my sister. My parents divorced when he was a teenager in the mid-80s, and at that point all bets were off for my brother. My mom is very easygoing and hippie-ish, but my father always laid down the law. With him out of the house, he now had the freedom to do as he liked. This was the time of satanic panic, heavy metal, Dungeons and Dragons, and the Commodore 64 computer, and my brother embraced all of it. He was a classically trained and naturally gifted artist before all of this. He regularly won contests, and his art hung all around our house as well as our schools and principals' offices. He attended art school twice a week, but once he got into heavy metal and D&D, his interests shifted. He grew his hair long, and his circle of friends began to change. They went from nerdy computer kids to heavy metal heads in motorcycle jackets and Iron Maiden t-shirts. They would often be over the house when I came home from school, and I could always smell what they had been up to. It was one of his new friends that would change our perceptions of reality and ideas about life after death. His name was Ed. He was a strange-looking guy, short, eccentric, and odd by all accounts, yet charming at the same time. Ed could also ride a unicycle and would regularly carry an Ouija board with him everywhere he went. He carried it on his back beneath a long black trench coat. What gave Ed credibility in our eyes was the way he used the board. He would only use one hand, barely touching it. And in a flat, emotionless tone, he would recite the words being spelled out. The planchette would move around so fast and deliberately that it was difficult to even see what it was spelling out. To me, seeing that as a little kid and not really understanding it was just so spooky. One night shortly after our uncle ended himself, our cousins were over, and Ed was also. He knew no one there other than my brother, nor did he know any of the details of my cousin losing his father. We were in my brother's room, and within a few minutes he contacted him.
Ed, who had never met my cousin before, said, I have a message for you.
John says he is at peace in purgatory now and to take care of your mother and sister. He said a few more personal things that my cousin thought were profound because Ed could never have known any of it. My cousin, crying now, said, "How do I know this is really even you?" Ed replied, "How about a picture? Maybe a headshot?" This rocked my whole family in that room. You see, my uncle took his life by shooting himself in the head. Even crazier still is that response was precisely his brand of dark humor and something he'd totally say. They were all reduced to tears, including my mother, who only came in to see why everything got so quiet. Ed became a regular guest at our house for a while, and the happenings became more and more strange for a while, but it would all eventually come to a head for my brother. One particular weekend my sister and I were with our dad and my mother was away, so my brother had the house to himself. He said he had a few friends over, and they were playing computer games in the basement. Next to the computer desk was the door to a large cedar closet. This was where my mother kept all of our seasonal clothes and all of her better clothing. For the most part, no one really went in there, and the door was always closed. There were 3 people there when the lights went out in the basement. Everyone froze in place. Then the door to the cedar closet began to slowly rattle. It was pitch dark, so they didn't know where it was coming from at first. Then it got louder and more intense, and someone lit a lighter. The rattling became banging, as if something was trying to get out. My brother said it looked like that heavy wooden door was going to burst from its hinges. To this day he is convinced that something huge was on the other side of that door that night. The 3 of them ran up the stairs, tripping over each other in the dark, and out the front door. When my mother came home the following afternoon, the front door was still wide open, and my brother was nowhere to be found. Eventually he turned up and told her what they had experienced the night before. She must have believed him because she had the house blessed shortly after. We all saw, felt, and experienced things in that house that could never be explained, but not all of it was scary or evil to me. My takeaway from growing up there was that sometimes people themselves are haunted. Maybe it's in the ways they interact with places that draws out different energies and projects them at that person. Our old house was on a corner and had a side yard with a small deck that wrapped around the back instead of a backyard. The dining room had patio doors that led out to the back, where we would have barbecues and other events. We had 1 desktop computer and 1 laptop for the family when I was about 14 years old. My brother and I would fight over the desktop, where Diablo 2 was installed, so I would write music on the laptop. My brother had a friend over one night, and they were downstairs doing whatever they were doing while I was at the dining room table on my laptop. I wasn't paying attention to my surroundings because I was so focused on my writing. I was startled when I heard a knock on the patio door. I raised my head, expecting to see my brother or his friend. The basement had a door that led to the back deck as well. A person wearing a Halloween pig mask stood at the door, waving. I said good one and gave the person the finger, thinking it was my brother or his friend, and they walked away. I went downstairs to give them shit as soon as they left, and to my surprise and dismay, they were both sitting on the couch playing PlayStation. They swore it wasn't either of them, and there was no way one of them could have gotten downstairs and unmasked before getting on the couch. To this day, I have no idea who knocked and waved. The creature in the woods. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping in the remote woods for the weekend. We were all excited to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the tranquility of nature. By the time we arrived, night had already fallen, so we hurriedly set up our tents and lit a fire, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows around our campsite. As we sat around the fire, we began telling ghost stories, each one more chilling than the last. The crackling of the fire and the eerie shadows it created added to the spooky atmosphere. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and even the simplest of sounds seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. We roasted hot dogs for dinner, but the taste was overshadowed by the spine-tingling tales we shared. Around midnight, we decided to put out the fire and get ready to turn in for the night, eager to wake up early for a hike the next morning. Just as we were about to retreat to our separate tents, we heard a rustling noise coming from the bushes. "Did you hear that?" Henson asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Yeah, I did," I replied, my heart beginning to race. Rabbit, Bruce retorted dismissively as he walked back to his tent. Henson and I stood there for a moment, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Reluctantly, we turned and started walking back towards our tents. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed out of the forest, making every hair on my body stand on end. I spun around, but still saw nothing. That's when Bruce turned his flashlight on, and there, in the beam of light, I saw them. A pair of glowing eyes, staring back at us from the bushes, unblinking and menacing. My heart pounded as we heard the creature emerge from the shadows. "I'm grabbing my rifle," Bruce shouted as he ran towards his tent, but the creature let out a howl so deafening that it brought us all to our knees, wincing in pain. The sound seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the night, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I slowly looked up, bracing myself to face the beast that I was certain would attack and kill us. It resembled a wolf, a gray wolf, but it was massive and stood on its hind legs. The creature was no shorter than 8 feet tall. I could see its huge fangs, with saliva glistening in the moonlight, dripping onto the ground. Its eyes burned with a feral intensity, and its fur bristled as it growled, sending shivers down my spine. The creature took a step closer, and that's when Bruce fired. He fired again and again, but then there was silence. I opened my eyes to see the creature still standing there, unscathed. It let out another bone-chilling howl before sprinting in our direction with terrifying speed. My friends and I aren't dumb. We took off running towards our trucks. My heart raced with fear as we ran, the creature's footsteps pounding the ground behind us, growing louder with each passing second. I could hear its ragged and menacing breath as it closed in on us. The pounding of my heart reverberated throughout my ears, almost drowning out the sounds of our frantic escape. I glanced back and saw it gaining on us with tremendous intensity. Its eyes glowed with malevolent hatred as it clawed its way toward us. In my panic, I stumbled and tripped over a tree root. Henson quickly turned around to help me up, and just as I could run again, I felt an intense burning sensation across my back. I cried out in agony but didn't dare stop running, the creature's growls echoing in the darkness behind us. We finally reached our trucks. I fumbled with my keys, my hands uncontrollably shaking. I managed to get inside, slam my door shut, and lock it just as the creature lunged at my car. It pounded on my roof with such force that the entire vehicle shook, its growls and screams echoing through the night, sending chills down my spine. Then it jumped to the hood of my car, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. It started beating on my windshield, each blow causing cracks to spiderweb across the glass. I screamed as the creature's claws tore through the windshield, shards of glass flying everywhere. In a desperate move, I quickly unlocked my door and leapt out into the bed of Bruce's truck as he was pulling out. Bruce and Henson both sped away as fast as they could, tires screeching against the dirt. I stared in horror as the creature just stood there, still perched on the hood of my truck, its eyes locked onto mine. To this day, we don't know what that creature was. I know what I believe it is. We all agree on one thing: we'll never go camping in those woods again. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that the creature is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next unsuspecting victims. A few weeks later, I couldn't get the experience out of my mind, so I decided to do some research. I found old legends and folklore about the area, speaking of a beast that roamed the woods, a creature that was neither man nor animal. Locals called it the Wendigo, a spirit of the wilderness that preyed on those who ventured too deep into its territory. The stories described it as a cursed being, transformed by its insatiable hunger and thirst for blood. I shared my findings with my friends, and we all felt a shiver run down our spines. The descriptions matched what we had seen that night, down to the last horrifying detail. We realized how close we had come to becoming another story in the local folklore, another set of names whispered around campfires. The thought of that creature still lurking in the woods, waiting for its next prey, was too much to bear. We made a pact never to speak of that night again, hoping that by staying silent, we could somehow escape its grasp. The silence was our shield, a fragile barrier against the terror that stalked the shadows. But every now and then, when the wind howls through the trees, I can't help but remember those glowing eyes and the terror we felt. The Wendigo is still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it remembers us too. The thought sends a chill down my spine, making me question whether silence is enough to keep the darkness at bay. The Birchwood Hag. Be alert. Stay cautious. Heed the warnings we tell. Tales, stories, and myths of the Birchwood Hag. It lures children to the edges of the forest with its mesmerizing melodies. Their cries echo through the branches, mimicking the wails of prey. They leave only shoes behind, scattered across the limbs of trees. Decorations or a warning to its next victims. Be alert. Stay cautious. Heed the warnings we tell. The words echo through my head as I look for my young. I sit alone, the flame of my campfire illuminating a few yards into the night. Not a single beast, big or small, has dared to utter a sound thus far, but I hear him. My son shrieks, the sound deafening. He calls for me. I quickly chase the shrill sound deeper into the forest. Stumbling blindly through the darkness. Run! Run! The cries of my young seem to get farther and farther the more I move towards that sound. A sickly sweet smell of sugar enters my nostrils. Shadowy figures loom over me behind each birch I pass. They tower over me. They peer at. No through me, chilling me to my core. I stop in my tracks. I cry out for my son. Nothing. I am only met with silence. I turn, my camp nowhere to be seen. I am lost. The smell of sweets tickles my nose once again as my eyes search for anything other than the trees around me. I see them. On the outstretched arms of the branch. Shoes. Children's shoes. The silence is broken with but a whisper to my left ear. Welcome. Dad, there's a monster in my closet. I woke up feeling a presence standing beside my bed, jolting me out of my sleep. It was my son, and it was 2:38 a.m. Dad, there's something in my closet. I'm scared. My wife rolled over at the sound of his voice. Huh? What's wrong, honey? She said, half asleep. Closet monster, apparently, I said. Oh, that's new, my wife said. Come here, honey, your dad will check it out. Come sit on the bed next to mommy. I got up from the bed slowly and stretched. My son slid under the covers next to my wife, and I saw her drifting back to sleep. I said to her, sure, you don't want to come along? It may take two of us to take this thing down. Nah, you got this, babe. I believe in you, she said with a sly smile, and if you don't make it back, well, you were a pretty good husband. I laughed and headed out of the room. My son's room was upstairs on the opposite side of the house, so up the stairs I went and made my way closer. The door to his room was wide open, but the closet doors, which you could see from the hallway, were closed. About 5 feet out in the hallway, I actually started to hear something from the closet, an intermittent hum. I slowed my pace a little at hearing it. My first thought was it was perhaps a tablet or other device under a pile of clothes playing some loud noise over and over. Whether it was or not, I got a lot more cautious and picked up a bat that was laying beside my son's dresser. With a bat in hand and after a deep breath to calm down, I grabbed the knob and turned it. As the door opened, I saw that I was at least correct about the noise coming from under clothes. A huge pile was stacked in the back corner, and the noise, much louder with the door open, emanated from it. The clothes were shifting slightly as the noise rang out. With the door open, I could tell it was a human voice. A child. I gripped the bat with white-knuckle force, and I started pulling the clothes away from the pile, despite the fear and sweat bursting out of me. Then I saw the source, but, what, impos. It was my son. He was restrained with a gag in his mouth. Tears streamed down his face. His face was beet red. I ripped the gag away. He inhaled deeply before letting out a scream. It wants mom. Coal mine ghost story. When I was just starting in the Emery/Consol coal mine, I was a red hat. Being one of those who could not be left alone or put in the mine by himself. To get the coal out of the seam, they dug 5 tunnels into it and labeled them 1 through 5. Tunnels 1 and 2 brought in clean air from outside and across the face, where they were using the continuous miner to cut the coal seam into little chunks. Picture a crab with a horizontal cylinder on the front with spikes that tore up the coal when it spun/rolled around. Tunnels 4 and 5 took the bad air from the face to back outside the mine. The middle tunnel number 3 was neutral air and held the belt line that dumped the coal from the shuttle car onto the belt till it hit a corner where the coal was dumped onto another belt till it was eventually dumped outside in a large pile. Between the tunnels, they cut crosscut tunnels into each of the tunnels, then closed off the crosscuts surrounding passageway 3 so the air would move down and around. Every fourth crosscut had a small door in the stoppage wall so you could move laterally from tunnel to tunnel as needed. One day I was told that one of the belt lines had shut down and the other belt had filled the junction with coal that needed to be shoveled back onto the belt. I was told it was okay as I was just down the entry tunnel from a working section, and if anything happened, I was to walk up to the section or call on the mobile phone located at the belt junctions. They had just sprayed powdered limestone on the surface of the coal, roof, floor, and walls, down in that section of the belt. This was to keep explosions down due to coal dust. I rode into the mine with the section personnel and got off where they showed me to dig the belt out. The coal was almost up to the roof when I got there. The belt line went uphill into the darkness. After several hours of shoveling, I noticed that someone was coming down the hill towards me, and it looked like they were trying to be sneaky by holding their hand over the light on their hard hat as it was flickering while they walked. The other miners liked to play jokes on each other, especially the new guys. I thought it was one of those times. I walked up the hill till I was across from a crosscut, and jumping the belt, I walked into the crosscut, turned off my light, and stood next to the corner using my shovel as a bat, waiting for the guy to come get me. The person walked up to just short of the corner and looked around. It was then I noticed that you could see my footsteps in the powdered limestone showing up as black steps where I walked. The person stepped back and walked back up the hill. I waited for a second and then jumped out, turning on my light to catch him. The footsteps coming down the hill could clearly be seen coming down the hill, stopping, turning around, and going back up the hill to the next crosscut. The two sets of footprints were separated by several feet. I jumped across the belt and ran up the hill to catch the guy, as the next crosscut was a blind stoppage wall, no door. When I got to where I could see into the crosscut, the footprints went into it and up to the wall with a heel print at the bottom of the wall. I stood there trying to figure it out for some time. Then I decided I should not be there by myself. I walked down to the mine phone and called the section, saying that there was no water down there and could I come up and get some? They said sure, come up and get some. I walked rather fast to the section break area and sat down. They had built a small kitchen break area to eat lunch in. One of the guys handed me a case of water bags and said go back to work. I said no. The section boss was sitting there and was pretty insistent that I go back to the belt area and go back to work. I told him no. He called the shift boss, who said I was to be fired and to keep me there. The guys from the section tried to persuade me to go back to work. I said no. The shift super was on his way. The section boss asked why I would not go back. I told him to go down and look the situation over and then decide if I needed to be down there by myself. He left and came back directly, sitting next to me, drinking several bags of water before he could speak. About that time the shift super came to the section and told me to get on the tractor. He was taking me out of the mine. The section boss told him to wait up and asked him to follow him down the belt line as I sat on the tractor. The guys in the section were again trying to get me to just go back down and go to work so I would not be fired. After about 15 minutes, both came back and asked me if I saw him. I said no, but he was just around the corner from me, and I thought it was one of the guys from the section trying to play a joke on me. I told him what happened, just as it happened, leaving nothing out. The whole section was there to hear it in silence. The super said the belt junction was shoveled out well enough and that I was to stay with the section and help out as needed. I was not in trouble nor going to be fired. I reluctantly got off the tractor. The super turned to the rest of the section and said, "Be careful, Reese is out and about." This shocked the crew. I, being new, did not know what that meant. After the super left, the section boss said to help tend the cables of the continuous miner so the miner would not run over them for the rest of the shift. Pretty easy work. Once back outside after the shift, I had several visitors. The foreman of the whole mine came by to ask questions and show him on a map where the incident occurred. Several old hands that walked the mine sampling the air at a different location, called fire bosses, also came by to chat. I still could not figure out what was going on. Finally, one of the fire bosses came up after everyone had left and pulled me aside and told me what was happening. I thought I was still in trouble. In the mid-40s, the mine was being operated by a small crew mining mostly by hand. They had imported one of the first continuous miners in the state. For lunch, they would go out to the entrance portal and sit down and make a fire and eat lunch. One windy day, the fire got out of hand and started the mine on fire. It took 2 weeks, along with a company of National Guard soldiers helping to get the fire under control. The continuous miner was still in the mine, and they were going to blow up the entry portal to seal the air from getting into the mine and extinguish the fire. Al Reese and another guy volunteered to go into the mine and hook chains to the equipment so they could pull it out of the mine and not lose thousands of dollars when they collapsed the tunnel. The two went into the mine and hooked up the chains. The folks at the portal pulled out the equipment to find the other volunteer sitting on the miner, dead, oxygen that had burned off down in the mine, black damp gas. Al's body was never recovered. From time to time, he shows up mostly down by the old works. He wears leather logging boots instead of the steel-toe rubber boots issued to miners at the time. He uses a carbide light on his hard hat that flickers instead of the battery-equipped one miner uses nowadays. The Forest Twins. I woke up to the sound of a woodpecker. I noticed that my friends were still sleeping. Last night we gathered around a campfire inside the forest. One of the guys read us tales about legendary wars and queendoms. After a while, I closed my eyes and drowned inside a pool of thousand dreams, only to be disturbed by the annoying noise of a bird in the morning. Soon enough, the woodpecker stopped drilling the tree. After a brief moment, the mysterious silence turned into a cry for help. I heard a voice that sounded like it was coming from a fallen soldier. An exhausted warrior who lost the path, or maybe got trapped. It seemed like the voice was from somewhere far away, but at the same time it was so clear that I wondered how my other friends wouldn't wake up. I decided not to wake them up, despite my instinct. I stood up and firmly stepped toward the direction of the voice. I wasn't close to the campfire anymore, but it didn't seem like I was getting closer to the source of the screams either. I was confused and at the same time curious. Once I went past a trail of trees, I saw two little children standing in the middle of a large area, devoid of trees and bushes. Two girls, both wearing a white dress and staring at me with haunting ocean eyes. They were identical in every aspect, as if they were nothing but clones. After a moment of pause, I figured out that the heartbreaking cry for help couldn't be heard anymore. One of the girls started talking. "Hello, fellow stranger. I'm Proserpina, and this is my twin sister Aurora. Could you please help us? We're looking for our long-lost toy." I agreed. We went to find the so-called toy together. We stomped weak leaves with our feet and passed what seemed like a path of million trees. I heard one of the girls say, "There it is, I can see it inside the shallow water." I stepped forward as they kept waiting. I tried to place one of my feet inside the water so I could go ahead, but something inside the water caught my eye. The water wasn't shallow. It was very deep. I could see the bones and clothes of a survivor with a cursed soul begging for mercy, only to lure me into his deathbed. I felt a heavy pulse of grief as I figured out the luckless prey is the same guy who narrated stories about the underworld and gods of time to us last night. I forgot to become aware of his absence when I woke up minutes ago because my attention was centered on the tremendously changed voice of him, which sounded very different. I turned around, only to see that the twins' eyes are now bloody red. They both whispered, "Thanks for helping us with finding our next toy."